So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I never really expected to cover today's creationist, mostly because I didn't really know he was an anti-evolutionist. As I'm sure you know, since you clicked on this video, the man of the hour is Frank Turek. Turek is primarily known for his Christian apologetics and is a somewhat controversial figure, to put it mildly. While most of his arguments, such as the cosmological argument, are outside the scope of this channel, and my own area of knowledge, I hadn't really planned to cover him, but then I found a video of his called Intelligent Design and Evolution. With a title like that, I couldn't let it go. Unfortunately, this video was apparently filmed on a potato and came in the amazingly awful resolution of 320 by 240, a resolution similar to that of the first ever webcams. In an effort to make this video watchable at 1920 by 1080, my normal resolution, I have put him on an old CRT TV and have just filmed that, being careful to match my frame rate to his 29.97 frames per second to avoid flickering and strobing. Before we start, if you would like this video, I'd greatly appreciate it. YouTube has not been kind to me when it comes to putting my videos in front of eyeballs, even those of my subscribers, and liking this video really helps with that. Well, let's dive in, shall we? Well, that was painfully 90s/early 2000s. I kind of expect a Lisa Frank school planner to jump out at me, or for my old Vampire the Masquerade dice to reappear from being lost so I can spend some vitae on keeping my breath warm on a cold night, all while I'm listening to the theme song for Power Rangers Lost Galaxy or Star Trek Deep Space Nine. As for the questions asked, does truth exist? Yes, there are indeed things that are true. Does God exist? I'm not here to answer that question. Are miracles possible? That's a malformed question, and both the supernatural and miracles tend to be notoriously poorly defined, so I'm not even sure the question is meaningful without much more context. Is the New Testament true? Well, that depends. Certain things in the New Testament are verifiably true, such as the existence of characters such as Pontius Pilate and Herod Antipas. Some of it is definitely not true, such as the slaughter of the innocents or the census where everyone had to go back to his ancestral city, thereby ruining the whole point of a census. A lot of it is in the probably true to maybe true category, like the Council of Jerusalem. Like virtually all works from the ancient past and antiquity, the books of the New Testament are neither rigorous works of history, nor simply all just made-up nonsense.
There's a common misconception in the general public that science is the bearer of all truth.
Is there, though? That's the philosophical position of scientism, and I'm not sure I've ever actually heard of anyone who truly adopts that position. Most people are happy to say that things like mathematics, history, and philosophy can also get us to knowledge. That is, things we believe in for good reason and that are true. Science is certainly a powerful way to gain knowledge, and it is one of the most reliable ways, since it has at its core the idea of testing, not just to see if you're right, but more importantly, testing to see if you're wrong.
And that whatever scientists say really is so.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but given the wild success of science in virtually every field to which it can be and has been applied, the rigor which normally characterizes the research, and the collective millennia of expertise in current experts, when a field reaches a strong consensus, it represents the best available explanation of the facts involved in that consensus. It's possible that this consensus is wrong, but until such time as it is demonstrated, the safe bet is to accept the consensus. This includes on things like the fact that chiropractic is basically a scam, and that climate change is very real and overwhelmingly driven by humans.
I'd like to talk today about this issue of science, particularly science doesn't say anything, scientists do.
Strictly speaking, this is literally true. Science isn't an active agent that can generally be the subject of a transitive verb in a literally correct statement, with a few exceptions. But that being said, there are still things that are absolutely not compatible with the data in science, and so science precludes those things. Vaccines don't cause autism. Separate ancestry for life forms so far known on Earth isn't true. Volcanoes or the sun being the driver of climate change isn't true. The Earth being a giant space pizza isn't true. The flood of Noah isn't true, at least not as a worldwide flood. The data absolutely preclude these things. And when scientists tell you that, Griping about the lack of agency of science as a concept won't help you any.
What they're finding is that ever since about 1980, there's been an increase in scientists going beyond the data. They are politicizing the data.
Who is this they? Is they Breitbart? Is it Fox News? Doesn't really matter. Scientists are allowed to advocate for political action and have science be a part of their reasoning. If you're in medical science and you know that a certain policy causes negative health outcomes for a significant part of the population, why wouldn't you advocate against such policies? If you're an ecologist, why wouldn't you advocate for better environmental protection regulation? Scientists are people too. They have interests, passions, friends, and families. They are not simple neutral arbiters of the data, at least not outside their actual peer-reviewed publications. I personally think that we could stand more science in politics, not less. Science is a big part of the reason that harmful things like cigarettes and conversion therapy are now heavily regulated and banned in various places. I have trouble seeing how that is not a good thing. It was science that both identified the hole in the ozone layer and got it fixed via international political action.
They are saying things like, science says we must, science says we should, science tells us we must, science tells us we should, science commands, science requires, science dictates, science compels.
Oh no! Humans anthropomorphizing something!
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Look at this, coming up to this current year, 2010. The one that is, it looks like the most prevalent is this idea, oh, that's the total. Science tells us we should.
So the biggest example of this is the one that, of those listed, has the least rhetorical force. If anything, scientists should be more active in giving people evidence-based advice within their areas of expertise. Although I will say they might want to shut up more about areas outside of their areas of expertise, as that can go badly wrong. If you want more information, look up the phrase Nobel disease when you're done with this video.
Science doesn't say anything.
Why do so many creationists not understand anthropomorphization? This is something I'm pretty sure I learned about in, 6th grade. It's just the imparting of human-like characteristics to non-human entities, especially inanimate or conceptual entities, by way of an analogy, to make communication easier or more evocative. No one is ascribing actual agency and political advocacy to science per se. They just don't want to have to say, the data strongly indicate that in order to maximally fulfill the goal under consideration, we ought to do so-and-so, or the equivalent.
Scientists, we have to interpret the data and make an interpretation from that point.
Yeah, and when all your data point to a particular direction, there's only so much interpretive freedom you have. For instance, all the data indicate that the climate is warming more or less in lockstep with the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that humans are by far the largest contributors to the increase in carbon dioxide in the last few centuries. So, there really are no valid interpretations that don't involve human activity as the current driver of climate trends. You can quibble about things like the exact contribution of non-human sources of carbon, and the results of climate change, and the likely future outcomes of climate change, but you can't honestly look at the data and support a conclusion that humans are having no effect, and that burning as much coal as possible won't exacerbate things.
But these individuals are getting authoritative, as if there's some sort of
Expert? Because, they literally are experts?
cosmic science god out there.
I'm lucky my eyes don't really have all that much in the way of mobility, because if they did, they'd have just rolled all the way to face the back of my skull, severing my optic nerve as it pulls apart from too much tension. I can see why people hate this guy.
Who tells us how we're supposed to live. In other words, it's gotten moralistic and politicized.
Imagine thinking that knowing verifiable things about how the world works wouldn't have moral or political implications. How would that even work? The only way to take actions that are political or moral is with some kind of expectation of the outcome of your actions. For example, let's say you were offered $1 million US. You don't have to do anything but accept the money, and it will be direct deposited into the US bank account of your choosing, and if you do not have such an account, the equivalent amount will be deposited into an account of your choosing in your country of residence. That seems like a perfectly moral thing to do. You're not being asked to do anything bad. But, as I'm sure many of you have seen coming, what if right before you decide to accept this offer, you're told that some random human somewhere will be instantly killed if you accept this money, for no other reason than that you have done so? Suddenly, what otherwise seemed like a perfectly acceptable thing to do no longer seems that way. Another example is that generally a person cutting open another person and taking bits out would be considered a horrible crime. But in the context of a surgery, it's perfectly fine and perhaps even praiseworthy. What is the difference in the moral standing in these examples? It is the knowledge of consequences. In the first place, you will be better off most likely with the money, but the expense to another person will be incalculable. And knowing that, Accepting the money makes you responsible. In the second case, the surgeon knows that what he is doing will more likely do good than harm. Science makes us better at knowing the consequences of our actions. It's why we try not to allow things like dumping toxic waste in rivers, and why we have slowed carbon emissions, although not nearly enough. Science informs politics specifically because it answers the question of what will happen if people do various actions. If you favor certain outcomes for society that can be influenced by public policy, why would you not advocate for policies designed to bring about those outcomes based on science, which will inform you what those policies are?
As I mentioned to you yesterday, I had an atheist at A&M, a biology student, who after the seminar, during the Q&A, we were going back and forth, and I finally said to him, I said, what is the origin of information?
That has no single answer and depends heavily on your definition of information and which information you're talking about. But under the definition used in information theory, the aspect of science that deals with information from a statistical standpoint, it can be literally anything that varies from a pulsar to an earthquake to a novel.
Information itself. And he said, that's not my field.
Well, given that information theory isn't biology, he was probably right, but I'll note that it's also not Turek's field.
I said, that's exactly the problem. You can't grant yourself information, and then once you grant yourself all these impossibilities, it seems, then take your worldview from that point up and say everything fits.
Why not? All logical reasoning has to start from some basic premises that are not evidenced or argued for. Now, don't get me wrong, you can make an argument that an assumption like this isn't properly basic and should be argued for, but Turek doesn't seem to be doing this. Further, if the reason you take something as an assumption without yourself delving into it is simply that everyone who has checked has more or less come to the same conclusion, with the only exceptions being kooks with motivated reasoning, then I'd say that's probably sufficient for most purposes.
No, you've got to explain all the data, not just the data in your little worldview.
No, I don't. That's insanely unreasonable. I literally don't have the ability or time to do that. Neither does anyone else. You have to pick and choose the things you're going to investigate.
We're not finding unity and diversity anymore as we used to at universities. We're staying in our own little narrow worldview. We don't understand philosophy anymore. We don't understand how these other disciplines impact the whole overall rubric of truth. We don't understand that. We zero in on this one little thing and we miss the big picture.
No, instead, scientists with different areas of expertise collaborate when there's overlap between their fields. Most of biology doesn't really overlap with information theory. Genetics tends to, but that's only part of biology, and even then it doesn't always. Most biologists will in no way benefit from knowing a bunch of stuff about Shannon information or signal entropy and whatnot. If Frank has a particular aspect of biology that he thinks would be improved by a wider appreciation of information science among those biologists who study it, he is welcome to make his case. But just blanket complaints about the fact that people have specialties and tend not to pontificate outside of their areas of expertise is just him whining.
So what about DNA similarity? Well, let's talk about it. We do have common DNA among different creatures.
Importantly, we have common DNA that forms a nested hierarchy that largely matches that taken from morphology, although not in all cases. Even more significantly, we have the same nesting pattern in non-conserved DNA, which completely negates the possibility of separate ancestry. But I'll let Frank cook a bit.
And it is true that DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans, but you know it's also about 90% between mice and humans.
Well, yeah, rodents being mice are in the glider clade, which includes lagomorphs, the bunnies and friends. It's the sister group to Euarchonta, which is a group that includes primates and colugos. We would expect mice to share a lot of DNA with primates in general, which would include humans.
In fact, because of the complex ways cells use genetic information, very small genetic differences can produce big functional differences.
Hence why mutation can easily lead to evolution. A relatively small mutation in terms of actual difference in the genome can lead to significant changes in the morphology or biochemistry of an organism. I thought Frank was trying to argue against evolution, not for it. Was I misled?
But that's not even the main point.
I mean, evolution mostly boils down to mutation, selection, and drift, so I'd argue it's at least one of the main points.
I mean, it could be 99% us and apes, 99.999, whatever you want to call it, and that wouldn't necessarily mean we had a common ancestor. Why not?
That's the thing, though. It rather would. At the very basic level, your genome comes from your ancestors. While horizontal gene transfer is a thing, it's fairly uncommon among things like complex multicellular animals, so we can mostly ignore it for now. Paternity tests rely on the fact that DNA similarity indicates genetic descent. So does using partial matches in forensics testing to identify the family members of a suspect. So too does scientific testing of various populations to determine things like mitochondrial or Y chromosome haplotypes. But we can go outside of a single species and see the genetic similarity with now extinct species of humans, such as Neanderthals or Denisovans. So where does this stop? Is DNA testing sufficient to demonstrate father-child relationships, but not cousin relationships? Is it okay for testing the genetic descent of different groups of people, like the natives of the Canary Islands and their connection to the native people of North Africa? Or the genetic link between Native Americans and the natives of Siberia? Can we demonstrate the genetic link between Homo sapiens and H. neanderthalensis? If it can do these things, then it just as well demonstrates the common ancestry of Homo sapiens and Pan troglodytes, or H. sapiens and Mus domesticus, or even the common ancestry of Elephas maximus and Penis glabra. If you want to argue otherwise, you have to show how we can tell where the indications of common ancestry become unreliable and why. You can't simply decide that because humans are the special boys of creation, that even greater similarities between them and chimps compared to, say, lions and tigers don't indicate common ancestry, even though most creationists think that lions and tigers do share common ancestry. So far, no reasons have been given that don't just boil down to post hoc excuses to keep humans special, and in some cases, to keep the number of animals on Noah's big boat down to a number that doesn't seem completely insane, just regular old partially insane.
Because DNA similarity could be evidence of a common designer rather than a common ancestor.
The problem is that in this case, we couldn't get a nested hierarchy and neutral variation, but we do. And we should expect to see things like common ecology and niche indicate high degrees of genetic similarity, but that is not the case. Common design would seem to predict that a dolphin and a shark should be more closely related than a dolphin and a moose. In fact, the dolphin and the moose are far more closely related. So on every testable front, separate ancestry fails in every novel prediction it makes.
Similar structures often have a similar blueprint.
Which, to be fair, is a prediction of design, based on how we see intelligent agents designing things. But then, what about when they don't? We have 4 lineages of truly flying animals: insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats. They all have very different wings. Why is that? Well, common design wouldn't predict that, with the possible exception of insects, given their vastly different size in most cases compared to most vertebrate flyers. But the difference between bat wings, pterosaurs, and bird wings is not predicted by common design. Instead, it is predicted by the fact that evolution is heavily contingent and cannot grab traits from outside of a lineage and port them over to another lineage, unlike an intelligent designer. Intelligent design predicts chimeras. Evolution predicts that we should not see such organisms. Evolution is winning this prediction competition by miles, or I guess 1.6 times as many kilometers for those of you who aren't Americans.
Have you guys ever seen this illustration? Have you seen this picture? Darwinist Tim Barra put it out.
I feel like he might not self-identify as a Darwinist.
He offered the progression of the Corvette as evidence of descent with modification.
No, he didn't. He offered it as an analogy, a way to help people understand gradualistic change through relatively minor modifications. He didn't use it as evidence. He didn't say to people, you see, because cars change over time, so do living things. I personally think it's a dumb analogy because cars don't reproduce, and they don't get their shape and internal configuration from the cars that went before them. 2 cars that roll off a factory floor one after the other aren't related at all, even if they're identical, because cars don't have genetic material that's passed from parent car to offspring car.
Look at the 1953 Corvette and the 1963, then up to the 1968, and then the 1978. You can see the progression there.
That's true.
That's evolution right there, baby.
No, it's because, again, there's no genetic descent with modification. It's just gradual change, but via a very different mechanism.
What's the problem with the illustration?
Everything I've been saying.
Yes! It's now known as Barra's blunder because this is evidence of intelligent design.
I've never heard of it being called that, and other than the University of New Mexico, every source I've seen referring to it as such is a creationist source, including, but not limited to, Evolution News, the Institute for Creation Research, Uncommon Descent, and Reasons to Believe. Anytime a term is virtually unheard of outside of pseudoscience outlets, you should be wary of it. Further, it's not evidence of intelligent design, because there was never a question of whether cars are intelligently designed, and because cars are produced in a fundamentally different way than living things that does not involve genetic descent. It doesn't do anything to demonstrate intelligent design in living things either, because living things and cars are not analogous in any way that matters to the question.
There's intelligent designers who did this. In fact, when Dr. Geisler had his debate with Paul Kurtz a number of years ago on the John Ankerberg show.
Does anyone in my audience even remember the John Ankerberg show?
Kurtz offered an illustration from the Wright brothers plane to the modern Boeing 747. And Geisler said, but who did that?
This is why I hate using things that don't have any genetic ancestry as an analogy for things that do. And the thing is that there are things with genetic ancestry that are not living things, like ancient texts such as the Bible or languages. In these cases, not only are the variations in a nested hierarchy, but they can be used to reconstruct the ancestor states. And further, we happen to know that in at least most cases, the changes in these things were not the result of intelligent agency intending them to change, although in the case of texts, that did occur, making them not as good an analogy as languages, but rather in virtually all cases the changes came about accidentally, without anyone willing it to be so. No one woke up one day and decided that they should really stop pronouncing most word-final consonants in French, or that they really wanted to do a great vowel shift in English.
That was done by intelligent designers, not some random process.
Something that was never in dispute.
And he kept persisting with the illustration, and Geisler finally said, stop using that, you're helping my argument. Because he was.
Only because Geisler had to pretend that an analogy was actually a model. Basically, in order for this to help creationism, rather than just being mostly useless to either side, the creationists have to lie about what the point of the admittedly dumb analogy is, or even that it's proposed as an analogy, rather than as evidence or as a model.
Go ahead, Greg.
Just an insertion that goes back to something that we talked about yesterday in argumentation here. Strictly speaking, this is not evidence for design, nor was it evidence for evolution. It is merely an illustration. Illustrations aren't evidence.
Thanks to Greg Kugel, and he's right about this. He is in fact another Christian apologist. I'm curious to see how Turek will take having his whole point from the last few minutes kind of demolished in one sentence from fellow apologists.
So when Barra puts this up, illustrating natural progression, he is using a designed thing to illustrate, allegedly, a natural progression. So he's using the wrong kind of illustration, and really it's an illustration of design, not evidence of design, but an illustration of design. But it underscores the point that illustrations are not arguments.
Agreed. Is Kugel even an anti-evolutionist? Yep, turns out he is. Maybe I'll have to cover him. Based on this, he seems to be a cut above Turek at the very least.
There is no evidence of any kind in this picture. All it is showing is a picture of a concept.
Okay, I appreciate the concept, but we can move on.
But it passes in the minds of many as evidence because you can give a powerful illustration. So keep this in mind. Again, I'm going to underscore what I said yesterday. Alternate explanations are not arguments, and all illustrations are sophisticated alternate explanations. Just because they can illustrate the point powerfully doesn't mean they've given powerful evidence for the point being illustrated.
How many times can one apologist repeat himself without adding to the discussion at all?
Let's go back to our question. Is Barra just seeing what he wants to see?
So no acknowledgement from Turek that he was just badly wrong about this being used as evidence, and the fact that he himself claimed it was evidence. Cool.
Of course! And that's a great point, Greg. It's not evidence, it's an illustration.
Finally. Also, that means that it's not evidence for intelligent design of organisms either.
Is he seeing what he wants to see? That's what he's seeing.
No, he's just making a bad analogy. It happens to basically everyone.
He's just seeing what he wants to see. Also, with regard to DNA similarity, Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. They have to explain how the bee, the octopus, the Venus flytrap, mildew, peacock, the porcupine, and the human are all somehow related by some sort of natural process without intelligence.
That's literally what evolution is. When genes stop being exchanged between populations, then mutations in one lineage can't be passed on to members of the other lineage. And so each lineage accumulates mutations that become more and more different. Like, this is one of the most basic aspects of evolution. The whole point of evolution is to explain the origin of biodiversity. That means why organisms are similar and also why they are different. Because that's what diversity is. Having stuff that's not the same.
Look at the dissimilarity, not just the similarity.
Agreed. Look at it. That's the point I've already made. The dissimilarity is just as important and it supports common descent just as much, and is in the same basic pattern. Does Turek think that biologists are under the impression that all organisms are essentially identical?
Notice that one of the main arguments here, the main arguments that they're bringing forth is called homology.
It's a main argument. I'm not sure I'd say it's the main argument.
Similarity. Well, that is an equally good argument for a common designer.
Except that it's not, though, because the pattern of homology and analogy isn't predicted by a common designer, but it is predicted by evolution. Common design should predict that homology will align more closely with the ecological needs of an organism than with anything else, but it simply does not. Birds and bats fly with very different wings. Different Antarctic fish use entirely different chemical means to keep ice crystals from forming in their cells. Platypus and snakes both produce neurotoxin, but despite similar method of action, they are completely different. The pattern of evident morphological homologies lines up with the genetics and the fossil record of organisms far better than it lines up with the actual needs of those organisms, meaning that disparate organisms that have superficially similar adaptations end up having different underlying anatomy and genetics, the exact thing common design does not predict, but which evolution does.
In other words, it's a wash here. They don't get anywhere with this.
No.
With this assertion. They're interpreting the evidence
That jump cut is in the original. I didn't add it.
that it's common ancestry when it could easily be interpreted as common design. Doesn't get anyone anywhere to talk about similarity.
Except that no, the pattern of homology and analogy follow a nested hierarchy. The only times I've seen design things fall into a nested hierarchy is when one of the design goals is to mimic not design processes, like evolution or historical linguistics. For example, Tolkien devised several Elven languages used in Middle-earth, more than just the ones you get samples of in The Lord of the Rings. They fit into a nested hierarchy specifically because he wanted his languages to seem like a real language family, something that isn't designed. Similarly, in speculative evolution, the whole point is for the organisms to look like they were not designed, so they too fall into nested hierarchies. But when you come to things where that isn't a design goal, such as mythical monsters, tools, vehicles, etc., you don't find a nested hierarchy. Sure, you can classify such things, such as into coupes, sedans, hatchbacks, trucks, etc., but someone else can come along and classify them by engine type, whether it be V4 or V6 or V8 or whatever. There's no objectively better way to do it, just subjective preference. But when it comes to classifying things like languages and organisms, there is an objective hierarchy that exists, and can be recovered using rigorous data-driven statistical means. That means that this classification isn't something arbitrarily imposed by humans, but actually reflects an underlying reality. That's important. The hierarchy isn't simply a social convention. It's not simply a tradition in biology. It's an objective thing. Now, what we call different parts of the hierarchy is arbitrary, but that does not negate that the hierarchy objectively exists.
How different would we need to be in order for them to say, you know, we're too different to have been related?
That's pretty simple. If there were no actual homologies, but only analogies, it would be a great start. If the handedness of some biomolecules in humans were different than in other life, that would be another great indication. If the genetic code functioned differently, for instance, instead of having codons of 3 nucleotides, if humans used codons of 4, or used codons of length 3 but with a different codon assignment, if the neutral variation in humans had no correlation outside of humans, with, for example, apes, or other monkeys, rodents, etc., any of these things would throw a big wrench into the idea of common ancestry of humans and other organisms.
Well, I think an octopus is a lot different from a Phoenix flytrap.
Yeah, no one is going to disagree with you there, but they still have conserved eukaryote genes that are missing in archaeans, and they have conserved genes with archaeans that are missing in bacteria, meaning that these differences and also the similarities are what you'd expect from them sharing a common ancestor. A common ancestor which, by the way, not only wasn't an octopus or a Venus flytrap, but wasn't even an animal or a plant. It wasn't even multicellular.
Right? Mildew is a lot different from a porcupine.
True, although in fact being a fungus and therefore a pisthicons, mildew is a whole lot more like a porcupine and an octopus than either is like a Venus flytrap. Indeed, genetic studies put the common ancestor of a porcupine and a Venus flytrap at about 2.2 billion years ago, as opposed to the common ancestor of mildew and a porcupine at about 1.3 billion years ago. You can see this even in the biochemistry of fungus, which rather than building cell walls from cellulose like plants, uses chitin, the same protein that makes up insect shells. Also, the digestive enzymes of fungi are similar to those of animals, and both are heterotrophs, as opposed to the autotrophic plants. See, it's the pattern of both similarity and difference that matters. Yes, mildew is extremely different from a porcupine, but they share more in common with each other than either does with any plant. and this is also confirmed in the genetics of fungi, plants, and animals.
But they're saying, oh no, they're all related.
Yes, because there is enormous evidence that that's true, and none that it's not. And there is counter-evidence to the idea of separate ancestry. We have good reason to accept eukaryote common ancestry, no reason to reject it, and no reason to accept eukaryote separate ancestry, and good reason to reject it. The clear winner is common ancestry.
You know, there's hardly anything written on about plant evolution.
That's weird because a Google Scholar search for plant evolution turned up about 6 million results. On the other hand, animal evolution turned up only 5,890,000. Granted, a bunch of that wouldn't have been written when Turek made his claim, but when I restricted the results to those written between 1800 and 2000, I get for plants 67,200 and for animals 28,100. If anything, plants seem to be overrepresented. So did Turek just lie? Did he just not check? What's going on here? I'll grant that when it comes to popular level work, animals are overrepresented compared to actual research, probably because humans tend to like things that are like themselves, and so the average human cares more about animals than plants. There's even a psychological phenomenon called plant blindness that explains that humans tend to gloss over plants and treat them more like inanimate parts of the environment than dynamic life forms. Did Turek just assume that the bias seen in pop science is also reflected in the literature?
But according to the Darwinists, plants have evolved too.
Yes, hence the millions of papers about plant evolution.
How so?
Mutation, selection, and drift, just like any other organism. I don't even understand the confusion here. Like, I get why he broadly rejects evolution, and so would reject it for plants as well as for animals, but why does he seem to think it's more implausible for plants than for animals? Are plants somehow less or more subject to mutation or drift or selection? Is there something about their morphology that just isn't influenced by genes such that natural selection can work? This seems to be a problem Frank is just making up in his head. I've never heard another creationist balk at plant evolution in a unique way or in contrast to animal evolution, as if one were much more likely than the other.
No idea.
I am very confident indeed that Turek has no idea. I can endorse that statement wholeheartedly.
Let's give you the entire quote from Dawkins now. I gave you the first sentence.
Okay, we're not going to elaborate on the whole plants can't evolve thing. Just a lie about the quantity of research on plant evolution, a statement of ignorance, and on to Dawkins. Sure, let's see what that piece of trash has to say.
In his exchange with Philip Johnson, here's the entire quote. Check this out. The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals.
Hey, I use that exact thing as one of the things that if it were found to not hold true, would falsify common ancestry. Neat.
My philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true.
What a shocker. Dawkins being so abysmal at philosophy that he thinks that a philosophical commitment itself has a truth value. Dawkins just never learned to stay in his lane, did he? One group of people that don't have to be as awful as Richard Dawkins is my subscribers. So why not subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so that YouTube might someday let you know when I have more content. You know, if they feel like it. While you're doing that, please hit like so that YouTube can show my video to people, you know, again, when they feel like it.
But I would prefer to characterize it as a philosophical commitment to a real explanation as opposed to a complete lack of explanation, which is what you espouse. Man, he's giving away the store here, isn't he?
Wow.
I don't even know what that means. He put up evidence of common ancestry and then said that it's evidence that he's right about naturalism, although he said it in an unbelievably dumb way. And while I think it's a non sequitur, it's not like it lends any credence to intelligent design.
He's saying it's true, my philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism. Well, if materialism is what he believes, and materialism is true, he ought not believe it. Why?
Let me guess. A very, 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 very dumb reason.
Because he can't know truth if materialism is true. Again.
Materialism being true does not stop propositions from conforming to reality. I don't even see how it could. So yes, you can believe true things, and you can have good reasons to think that they're true, whether or not materialism is true.
It's self-defeating. Go back to our quote with Crick, remember?
I don't, because I suspect that's from an earlier episode of whatever this is, and I haven't watched any of the earlier episodes. If they're all like this, but about topics I care less about, I can't imagine I will ever watch them.
When Crick said, the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your thoughts, your feelings, your dreams are just a bungle of nerve endings, basically, just molecules in motion. Well, then his thought right here is just molecules in motion. His thought about the universality of genetic code is just molecules in motion.
Yeah, and? Look, a calculator is just electrons in motion, yet if I ask it to perform arithmetic functions, it reliably gets the right answer. Nothing about the possibility that the mind reduces to material components indicates that, for this reason is incapable of coming to correct conclusions on the basis of good evidence or rationale. If the mind boils down to ions and molecules going around doing things, that's not fundamentally different to a calculator reducing down to electrons going around doing things. And just like the latter is generally reliable, so too can be the former. I'm not saying it has to be, but I see no fundamental reason why a purely physical brain cannot produce a mind capable of reliable reasoning. Further, I see no reason why an immaterial mind must be any more or less reliable than a material one. This seems to just be Turek saying, "Ha! You think you're made of matter, and I declare you a dum-dum because you do, so near. Maybe he gave an argument before, but somehow I doubt it. Further, evolution doesn't require materialism. Many non-materialists accept evolution. Sure, evolution is compatible with materialism, but it's also compatible with supernaturalism, near as I can tell.
He doesn't really have free will. He doesn't have the ability to choose.
Neither of which are necessary to believe things that are true for good reason. My calculator doesn't have freedom to choose or free will either. If anything, that makes it more accurate. Now, I wouldn't argue that a lack of choice or free will makes humans more or less accurate, but I don't think it weighs in favor of less accurate.
He doesn't have the ability to know truth.
Yeah, that's a citation needed right there.
It's just chemicals firing.
Yup.
He's ruling out intelligence beforehand. He's begging the question. He's assuming what he's trying to prove.
Not in that quote, he's not. He's just noting that common ancestry seems true, and that it's compatible with naturalism. Then he does go on to make an unjustified leap to that demonstrating the truth of naturalism, and he phrases it like an idiot, but that's not begging the question. It's also not ruling out intelligence beforehand. I'm frankly kind of amazed that Turek is somehow worse at philosophy than Dawkins is. I had rather assume that Dawkins was near the floor on that one. Good to know someone can be so much worse at it than him.
Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. And that's what he's saying right here.
Oh good, back to whining about anthropomorphization. Hey, Frank, if you watch this, I'm sorry that you hate basic human behavior so much. Maybe get a therapist rather than spouting nonsense on TV.
All right, microevolution. Microevolution. In 2004, by the way,
A tangent before even finishing a single clause in the first sentence of a new topic. That has to be some kind of record.
I just had an email exchange with Jonathan Wells yesterday. I don't know if you know Jonathan Wells. He wrote the book Icons of Evolution. He's at the Discovery Institute.
Yeah, he's also a moronic lying piece of shit. Who the fuck cares? He's also a Mooney, so that's fun. You gotta love a cult member who got into science deliberately to destroy science.
A very, very clear thinker.
Are you serious?
He has a PhD in biology from UCal Berkeley.
Very little I've ever covered has made me want to hit Alt F4 on myself as much as this sentence.
I think he has another PhD from somewhere else. Anyone know where? Wells? He's got 2 PhDs. He's like Dembski. He's forgotten more than I'll ever know. Brilliant guy.
Make sure you golf clap at home for John Wells, the guy who bafflingly thinks that natural selection just isn't a thing. Also make sure you check out this video about him that I've put up in the card above.
I was emailing him because I heard him say recently there's just a couple of categories that evolutionists make, or a couple of categories into which you could place the arguments that they make.
If you want to be reductive about it, sure.
And the 2 categories he mentioned are homology, the one we just went through, and the second is microevolution.
Where do things like natural variation and endogenous retroviruses fit in? What about the universality of the genetic code or the handedness of biomolecules?
When you unpack, or when you cut through all the fog that the evolutionists try and put forth as to evidence, you can put them into those 2 categories. It's a similarity argument, or it's a micro to macro argument.
Oh, so he just thinks similarity is the same as homology, which, no, it's not, and micro to macro doesn't even make sense. The distinction between micro and macroevolution was coined by entomologist Yuri Filipchenko. He created it because he believed that while Darwinian mechanisms could explain minor changes in a species, that going from one species to another needed big macromutations that caused a large change all at once and created a new species in a single generation. Now we do know that things like that can happen. For instance, plants frequently have whole genome duplications, resulting in new species in a single generation. But it can happen in animals too. One famous example is the crayfish, crawdad, mudbug, ditchbug, freshwater lobster, mountain lobster, or yabby, depending on where you're from, Procambarus virginalis, which evolved in a single generation from its predecessor and still going strong in the wild, Procambarus phallax. But while these kinds of macromutations do happen, most speciation is simply a result of a lot of microevolution with a lack of gene flow. As populations accumulate mutations without trading genetic material back and forth, they diverge, and become more and more different. Eventually, it becomes reasonable to call them different species and macroevolution has occurred. Remember, macroevolution is just any evolution at or above the species level. If you have a few years to spare and you don't mind raising fruit flies, you can watch macroevolution happen in real time by just separating out some fruit flies and giving them different diets for a few years, and hence hundreds of generations.
That's it, basically. Okay, that's their evidence.
I still think it's a vast oversimplification, but if you want to toss everything into one of two buckets for some reason, I can't stop you, and I don't really care to.
Well, let's take a look now at the micro-argument. In 2004, you may have seen this edition. In fact, I have this edition at home.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I did see it. It's an example of Bettridge's law of headlines that says that anytime you see a journalistic headline asking a yes or no question, the answer is no. And no, this isn't a rigorous scientific law.
National Geographic came out with an entire edition, Was Darwin Wrong? That was the cover. You remember this? What conclusion do you think they made? Gee, no surprise there, right? Was Darwin wrong?
I mean, yeah, he was wrong about gemmules, blended inheritance, the age and cause of a river valley in South America, and plenty of other stuff. But he wasn't wrong about natural or sexual selection. At least, not in the broad strokes. And that's what he's remembered for. It's kind of like asking if Isaac Newton was wrong. Well, he was sure wrong about whether mercury is safe to eat. And it turns out there's way more to mechanics than he could ever have known about. But no, he was still right at classical scales about his laws of motion and universal gravitation.
Well, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. These scientists said, no, Darwin wasn't wrong. Here was their main evidence, and I'm not making this up. When you go inside the magazine, this is what you will see. This is their main evidence. Is that a bulldog?
Yes, it is. Specifically, it's an English bulldog.
Why is that their evidence, do you think? Why would they put a bulldog up there? Here's why. They're saying that dog breeding is an example of evolution.
Well, evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. Dog breeding selects various alleles and intentionally breeds those animals with them in order to increase their prevalence in a breed, which itself is a population. So yes, it is an example of evolution. The only way to say it's not is if the evolution you're talking about isn't the one that biologists are talking about when they talk about evolution.
Dog breeders can breed dogs as small as a Chihuahua and as large as a Great Dane, right?
They can get dogs bigger than that, but yes, minimally we know that they can at least do that. And we also know that this level of size variation, as well as just the existence of the size extremes, is unknown in wild wolf populations. This means that breeders didn't get to modern dogs by selecting from wolf diversity. There were unique mutations that occurred in dogs and that were spread by human breeders, or in many cases, simply by natural selection as dogs weren't at first intentionally bred. Indeed, many dogs actually don't belong to breeds, but rather land races, which is a variety of domesticated animal that results from natural adaptation to being domesticated in a particular environment, but was not intentionally bred for by humans. Some examples include the Carolina dog, the Saluki, and the pariah dog.
They can get a lot of variation in the genetic code of dogs to get a lot of that variation there. They can get all those different types of dogs. And so what they're saying is that we can do this in a very short period of time, this breeding. We can do it in a very short period of time. So macroevolution over a long period of time can go much further. In other words, they're extrapolating from micro into macro.
Yes, because observably, macroevolution normally occurs as a result of just lots of microevolution. Saying this doesn't count is like watching someone put water into an empty Olympic swimming pool with a hose for a few minutes and then noting that the pool wasn't full when you stopped watching, and from there concluding that you can't fill Olympic-sized pools with a hose. It seems very obvious that yes, you can, and if you want to say you can't, you need more than to just say it didn't happen while you were there watching in less time than is expected for it to happen. The fact is that microevolutionary changes build up and tend towards macroevolution, just like the amount of water in the pool builds up and tends towards filling the pool. If you want to deny that pool filling or macroevolution are possible via the proposed mechanisms at this point, you need to propose a barrier.
Now, if anyone ever asks you, do you believe in evolution, what should your first question be? Hint, it's tactic 1. What do you mean by that?
Or you could just say yes and move on with your day.
What do you mean by evolution?
I usually mean that change in allele frequency in a population over time and or universal common ancestry.
because there's at least two distinctions or two different types you need to talk about. If you're talking about micro, I'm with you. Yeah, I see micro. Micro happens all the time.
That's true.
And the ability of a particular type of creature to adapt itself to its environment. Yeah, no problem, okay?
I mean, that can be part of microevolution, but most evolution at the molecular level is dominated by drift. Neutral variation will build up in populations over time regardless of how well they're adapted to their environments. This is why neutral variation is so important in testing relatedness between lineages. Because such mutations are not under natural selection, they are free to vary, meaning that such mutations can only be caused by the patterns of descent acting neutrally. The nucleotide sequences will not converge or diverge as a result of selection, which can obscure the phylogenetic signal.
See it all the time. But if you're talking about macro, I don't think you can extrapolate from micro to macro, but they say we can.
Because they've watched it happen numerous times in real life, both in the wild and in labs. Like I keep saying, if you want to watch it yourself, there are inexpensive experiments you can do at home. Of course, your housemates or significant other might not like you running fruit fly experiments at home, but that's a you problem, not an evolution problem.
You know why we can? Because if breeding in a short period of time can do this, then macroevolution over a long period of time can do that.
Yeah, the argument is just, hey, we can see large amounts of morphological change in a relatively short time. So in a longer time, we could see more morphological change. This is just the same argument as noting that if I have an egg and then grab another egg, I now have 2 eggs. If I repeat this process, I could get any arbitrarily large number of eggs. If you want to say that's not true, you have to provide a problem for my extrapolation, like how many egg-laying animals exist and noting that eventually I'd have all the eggs, or noting that some of my eggs will rot away and not really be eggs after a certain time, meaning I'll likely reach an equilibrium. These are the kinds of barriers that we would need to say that microevolution cannot proceed to macroevolution.
Or natural selection over a long period of time can do macroevolution.
No, on its own, natural selection cannot cause macroevolution. It needs mutations to do so. The main mechanisms of evolution can't just be separated from each other and then expected to account for evolution on their own. That's like saying cake is just flour.
Here's the problem. Here's the big but.
I like big butts and I cannot lie.
But if intelligent breeding meets genetic limits, then how can non-intelligence exceed them?
That might be a problem, but I'm not aware that selective breeding has hit any genetic limits. Indeed, new breeds are created all the time as a result of mutation, such as the Sphinx cat, which is a fairly recent breed of cat that is hairless because of mutation in one kitten in the 20th century. That's whole new genetics coming into play in selective breeding. So when taken synchronically, I guess you can say that breeders might have reached some theoretical limit of the genetics of an organism with which they are working, but since evolution is fundamentally about change over time, I think looking at populations synchronically is useless in evolution, and only a diachronic picture makes sense in this context. When looking at selective breeding diachronically, it's not clear to me that there are indeed genetic limits. Genomes seem to be able to vary to any degree, although not at any rate. So to see a certain level of variation, it may take a long time.
I mean, here we are with all our intelligence. These breeders try and breed all these dogs, but they run into genetic limits. They can go small as a Chihuahua and as large as a Great Dane, but they can't go beyond those limits. There appear to be limits, and using all our intelligence, we run into limits. So why should we expect non-intelligence to exceed them?
Okay, but noting that there seem to be size limits for a particular group of animals isn't a genetic limit. It's a physical limit to the morphology of the creature. A genetic limit would mean that the genome of a creature, for some reason, couldn't mutate in certain ways. That's not what morphological limitations are. Evolution isn't untrue because you can't get a dog the size of Godzilla. What stops a dog from evolving into something that is extremely different and recognizably a different species, but staying within the actual physical limits imposed by just having to exist in an environment? I don't see anything.
You say, well, we just need more generations. Tried it. Done it with E. coli bacteria. 40,000 generations. There's a guy at the University of Pittsburgh, I think, that's been doing this for 25 or 30 years. What does he have now?
This is a reference to the Lenski long-term Escherichia coli experiment, and what he has now is macroevolution, because part of the definition of E. coli is its inability to metabolize citrate under aerobic conditions, but now some strains in the experiment can, meaning that they no longer meet the species definition for E. coli, and so speciation has occurred, which means macroevolution has occurred. That these strains have not been given a new binomial is just a choice made by the humans conducting the experiment.
E. coli bacteria.
Not in every case. Some of those bacteria would fail one or more of the basic tests for whether or not a bacterium is E. coli.
Tried it with fruit flies, because they have very short lifespans. Many generations. Fruit flies. What do we have now?
Artificially induced speciation, meaning macroevolution. Again, that these variations were not given a new specific designation is immaterial. Speciation by the biological species concept can be induced in a lab in fruit flies in a few years. That means that's macroevolution.
Mutant fruit flies.
Yeah, that's rather how evolution works. Noting that evolution works in an experiment about evolution isn't exactly a big win for saying evolution is wrong. It's like telling a Christian that the fact that Pontius Pilate really existed is a problem for Christianity. You might think that's a problem for Christianity, but only because you apparently don't understand Christianity.
Okay, they're still fruit flies.
Of course they are. If they weren't, then something other than evolution as we understand it occurred. Phylogeny is like an append-only ledger. If you had fruit fly entered into your ledger, you can't take it off. You can only add new entries. And if anyone looks at the ledger, fruit fly will always be there. You can't evolve so much that some of your ancestors are no longer part of your ancestry. That doesn't even make sense.
Some of them have wings coming out of their heads. They're not advantageous mutations.
Here Frank is mixing up studies in speciation with studies about mutation and genetics. The mutations he's describing were induced to use fruit flies as a model organism to uncover how genetics works. These experiments were not about speciation. Other experiments are about speciation and do not involve weird, obviously harmful mutations to fruit flies being induced. In fact, in speciation studies on fruit flies, you don't have to induce mutations at all. The natural mutation rate of the flies is plenty. I suppose I'm not surprised that Frank doesn't even know which experiments he's talking about. But I'm still disappointed.
We still have fruit flies, and we're using our intelligence to try and manipulate them, and we still can't break the genetic barriers.
All experiments are designed by intelligent agents. That doesn't mean that the phenomena observed are only the result of intelligent agents. Look at the Cavendish experiment that was used to measure the value of the gravitational constant originally in order to calculate the mass of the Earth, since the gravitational acceleration of the Earth was known. It uses the horizontal attraction of large masses suspended on a torsion bar, thereby cleverly cancelling out the otherwise overwhelming gravitational pull of the Earth. Further, in well-constructed versions of the experiment, care is taken to electrically ground and shield the apparatus and to protect it from any wind currents. That's a whole lot of intelligence needed to conduct a good Cavendish experiment. Yet, does that mean that gravity requires intelligence? I hardly see how. Creationists are all about that laboratory science until it shows they're wrong. Then they just pretend that since experiments are set up by intelligent agents, that means that experiments are also somehow demonstrate creation by an intelligent designer, even when they absolutely do no such thing. Talk about having your cake and eating it too.
Greg.
Yeah, something might be said here about the problems with even microevolution, because I think it's fair to acknowledge that microevolution happens, but when you get closer to the details themselves, there's some significant question whether even in so-called microevolution, whether or not you actually ever get any new or novel features.
Or new information.
New information.
Yeah.
That's literally what mutations are, and there is absolutely no question that mutations occur. Earlier, Greg stepped in as the voice of reason, but I guess now he's just tossing all that away to be a de facto mutation denier, which is weird, since we can measure mutations both across generations and over phylogenetically relevant timescales.
What you get is a restructuring of things, or rather an expression of things that are already there.
That's weird because until 1966, the hairless trait in Sphinx cats didn't exist. Until the early 20th century, the traits that HIV uses to infect humans instead of other apes didn't exist. Until the 1980s or so, the trait that allows the marbled crayfish to reproduce asexually didn't exist. Until the mid-20th century, nylonase producing bacteria didn't exist. Until the late 2000s, the trait of being able to metabolize citrate in an aerobic environment didn't exist in the subjects of the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. We know for a fact that this is bullshit. New traits occur all the time in many lineages. It happens through mutations, and this is well understood. Greg and Frank are just denying basic reality. Also, of course, don't hold your breath for them to define what they mean by information in a way that actually lets us check if it has increased or decreased in a lineage, or if there's new information generated in any particular circumstance. Once they do that, then it will be trivially easy to show that new information does indeed arise all the time. So they'll just keep it nebulous, or at least that's my prediction.
And may already be manifest in the populations, but in such a small amount, you don't notice it.
Nope, and we can tell because in many cases, the known mutations are so advantageous that they cause a near instantaneous selective sweep, and they are immediately noticeable. I promise, the CYP plus trait wasn't subtle. Neither is HIV infecting a human. Neither is a cat that doesn't grow fur.
So when you have the famous case of the peppered moth in England,
which has never been put forth as an example of a new trait, but rather of natural selection, which can only act on existing traits. Once again, pulling a single mechanism of evolution out and complaining that on its own it doesn't explain all of evolution is dumb. Just like describing a cake as flour is dumb. Evolution is an emergent phenomenon, meaning that no one aspect of it can possibly explain everything about it. You need at least a minimum of few mechanisms to explain it all. Just mutation, just selection, or just drift won't get you there. All of them act together.
You have the melanic variety, the darker variety, and the white.
Yep, those varieties had to already exist in order for natural selection to act at all.
Those varieties always existed in the population.
No, they didn't always exist. At some point, those traits came into being via mutation. It's just that it was probably a long time before the well-known natural selection-driven microevolution.
It's just that the force of the environment through natural selection changed the relative numbers of the population.
Wait, is Greg telling us that there was a change in the frequencies of particular alleles over time as a result of natural selection? Well, guess what? That's literally evolution by natural selection. That is not all of evolution is immaterial.
It didn't create one thing into another thing.
I don't even know what that means, but it certainly was evolution by natural selection. You know, the thing Darwin was kind of known for.
So strictly speaking, there is no evolution even of a micronature going on there.
Except that, you know, Greg just literally described the occurrence of evolution by natural selection in English peppered moths. What a wild take to just describe accurately an observed and documented instance of evolution, explain how it was indeed evolution, and then say, see, there was no evolution. Greg could look at a clear blue midsummer Arizona sky and tell you it's green.
There is natural selection that's changing the relative densities of population.
Well, allele frequencies, population density is something else, but yes, that's evolution. Greg doesn't have to like it, but what he's describing is evolution. Granted, there's more to evolution than that, but what he is describing is a minimal form of evolution.
And so it gives the impression that there is an evolution to one variety and then an evolution back to the other variety.
Yeah, in the same way that putting an egg in boiling water for a few minutes gives you the impression of making a boiled egg.
When the conditions changed there in England after the Industrial Revolution. This is true with the finch's beak as well. The famous Darwin's finches that have the larger beak and the smaller beak. Again, you have no novel information that's being caused by some Darwinian mechanism.
Obviously, Darwin didn't know about genes, DNA, or mutation. Mutation is a non-Darwinian mechanism, but it's still a part of evolution, because evolution isn't Darwinism. We've moved on from Darwin a long time ago.
What you have is a change in population size.
Actually, I'm unaware of any population size studies done on peppered moths, but okay, changes in population size are not on their own evolution.
Through natural selection, certainly, but only a change in population size, not actual evolution.
That's only something you can say if you either don't know what evolution is or you're a liar. Right now, I'll be generous and say that Greg just doesn't know what evolution is.
Not introduction of novel features even on a micro level.
Yes, that requires mutation, and we have lots of examples of that too.
So the idea of microevolution we can kind of give the nod to, but even then we're giving more credit than is due given the evidence.
Exactly. Well said. That's often overlooked.
That Frank thinks that was well said tells us that he either just fundamentally does not know what evolution is, or that he is also a liar. I'm not prepared to say he's a liar, so I'll just assume that he stupidly thinks he can debunk evolution without even knowing what it is in the first place. Which, you know, isn't a great start.
What we are saying is there is a certain sense of microevolution going on, but not macroevolution. As Greg just pointed out, it's really not change, it's a change in proportion of the given population.
A change in the proportion of various alleles in a population over time as a result of differential reproductive success determined by the environment. If only we had a term for that. Maybe we could call it something like Schmevolution by Schmatural Schmelection. Yeah, that sounds good.
In fact, Darwin's finches, after the proportion of long beak to short beak finches changed with the weather changes.
Yeah, this is that thing that we call natural selection, and while it's not enough to explain all of evolution, it's a pretty major aspect of it.
You know, when drought, I think they had longer beaks to go deeper.
That's what she said.
And when you had wet season, they had shorter beaks because they didn't need to go as deep in order to. But what changed was just the proportion of the long beak to short beak finches. They didn't get anything other than finches.
Earlier in the series, I pointed out that evolution is an append-only ledger. You can't erase previous entries because those relate to ancestry, and you can't do anything to remove your actual ancestors from your ancestry. If you descend from finches, finch will always be in your evolutionary ledger. no matter how many new entries you make beyond it. So fundamentally, you are a finch, as will be all your descendants. I am, for the sake of the series, ignoring the fact that Darwin's finches are actually tanagers, or New World finches, which are in a different family to the true finches in Eurasia and Africa. I'll just be calling them finches going forward to keep my terminology for the animals consistent with Frank's.
And by the way, as Philip Johnson points out, what's often overlooked is, where did the finches come from to begin with, right?
Well, Darwin's finches themselves form a monophyletic clade and all descend from a single ancestral finch species that washed ashore on the Galapagos archipelago. Since then, they've diverged into about 18 separate species, although the exact number is still not super well established. This means that Darwin's finches are an example of macroevolution. Indeed, it's not just speciation, but there are currently 5 genera among the finches: Geospiza, Camarhynchus, Platyspiza, Certhidia, and Peneuroloxius. If we go for a wider analysis, the finches are members of the family Thropidae, the tanagers or New World finches. These are passeriform birds native to the Caribbean, South America, and Central America, stretching into northern, west, and east, but not central Mexico, and even into the southernmost tip of Texas. Passeriformes are one of the major groups of Neoaves, the group of birds that includes such diversity as parrots, eagles, and canaries. Neoaves is a part of Neognathae, which also includes the ducks, chickens, swans, grouse, and all their buddies, all of whom are in aves, along with the ostriches, emus, rheas, and tinamous. The groups Paleognathae, Galloancerea, and Neoaves are all groups of birds that diverged in the late Cretaceous and made it through the end Cretaceous extinction event.
He says natural selection can help explain the survival of the species, but not the arrival.
The origin of new variation in organisms is mutation. This isn't a mystery, and we know that Turek already knows this. Pretending that this isn't the explanation is just disingenuous. I get that Frank probably doesn't think that it's an adequate explanation, but he needs to engage with it. Otherwise, he's arguing against a straw man. No one is saying that natural selection on its own is anything but a force that decreases genetic entropy. Pointing out something that all evolutionary biologists are aware of, and that is a core part of evolutionary theory, is not an argument against evolutionary theory.
Where did they come from to begin with?
I feel like I already covered this. Well, Darwin's finches themselves form a monophyletic clade and all descend from a single ancestral finch species that washed ashore on the Galapagos archipelago. Since then, they've diverged into about 18 separate species, although the exact number is still not super well established. This means that Darwin's finches are an example of macroevolution. Indeed, it's not just speciation, but there are currently 5 genera among the finches: Geospiza, Camarhynchus, Platyspiza, Certhidia, and Peneuroloxius. If we go for a wider analysis, the finches are members of the family Thropidae, the tanagers or New World finches. These are passeriform birds native to the Caribbean, South America, and Central America, stretching into northern, west, and east, but not central Mexico, and even into the southernmost tip of Texas. Passeriformes are one of the major groups of Neoaves, the group of birds that includes such diversity as parrots, eagles, and canaries. Neoaves is a part of Neognathae, which also includes the ducks, chickens, swans, grouse, and all their buddies, all of whom are in aves, along with the ostriches, emus, rheas, and tinamous. The groups Paleognathae, Galloancerea, and Neoaves are all groups of birds that diverged in the late Cretaceous and made it through the end Cretaceous extinction event. Yep, I did.
All right, how about molecular machines?
Okay, I guess Turek doesn't know what a segue is. Cool. Let's hear about molecular machines.
Molecular machines. Take a look at this. As you've probably seen this quote, according to Charles Darwin, Darwinism's dead. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight changes, my theory would absolutely break down.
He did say that, and gave the eyes as one of the more obvious examples of such an organ, but then went on to show how, in fact, no, it was not impossible for evolution, and in fact is rather trivial. Now, he did not do the same for any subcellular chemistry, because he obviously was not aware of such things.
And of course, sort of the mascot of the intelligent design movement is the bacterial flagellum.
It probably shouldn't have been, given how poorly that went on Michael Behe's cross-examination in the Kitzmiller v. Dover trial. You know, the one where it became very clear that either Behe lied about looking into the literature of the evolution of the flagellum, or that he was wildly incompetent as a researcher. Since then, things have only gotten worse for people claiming that we don't know how the flagellum evolved. And of course, it's actually worse than this. We don't actually have to know how it did evolve in order to defeat this argument. The argument is that it can't evolve, and so any possible account of its evolution is enough to defeat the argument, even if that exact account isn't how it happened.
And if you take a look at the bacterial flagellum, it's the width of an E. coli bacterium cell, which...
No, it's actually considerably smaller than the width of a single E. coli bacterium, Which, makes sense since E. coli have flagella as part of them. Even the video on screen shows a flagellum as a tiny little tail sticking out of a cell.
Which is about 1/1000th the width of a human hair, so you could line up 12,500 in an inch of these things.
Okay, if you have big number, therefore God on your bingo card, you can mark it off.
It has 240 distinct proteins.
Wait, was there just creepy whispering audio? Is this tape secretly haunted? Yeah, there is. What the hell is going on? I swear I did not add that. That's actually pretty weird and creepy.
It has a microscopic outboard motor on its tail that runs at an incredible 100,000 revolutions per minute.
It's not really incredible. The smaller a rotor is, the faster it will spin given a certain amount of torque. This isn't exactly high-level physics. It's a bit of trig, and that's all.
This is a little motor here.
Strictly speaking, yes.
And it only takes a quarter turn to stop, shift directions, and start spinning 100,000 RPMs in the opposite direction. I don't even know if we have a motor that can do that ourselves.
Yep, some industrial motors can hit rotational speeds 2.5 times that. And humans have managed to make a tiny rotor that hits 1,000,000 RPM. But who cares? The question isn't whether human engineers can do a thing, because whether they can or not doesn't matter. The question is, can evolution do a thing? And so far, all that we've heard is that it's small and spins fast, none of which seems like a barrier for evolution to me.
And it's irreducibly complex. It must have been created all at once, because you can't have function of a motor as it's being put together. The whole motor needs to be there at the same time in order for you to have function. Yeah, you can build a car in successive steps, but you can't drive your car when it's halfway built, right?
So this is basically Behe's main argument, and there have been a few interpretations of it that are in circulation in creationist circles. First, we can start with what an irreducibly complex structure is. A structure can be said to be irreducibly complex if it is necessarily composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. That's an almost direct quote from Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. There are 3 basic forms of the argument. The first is the one that Behe seems to give in his book, which is that Darwinian mechanisms can't account for the evolution of these systems. Since of course that only includes variation, inheritance, and natural selection, and not any of the other myriad evolutionary mechanisms that we know about, that's not a problem. The second option is that in saying Darwinian, Behe actually means all evolutionary processes that are not directed by a purposeful designer and intelligent agent, and that none of these can allow for the evolution of an irreducibly complex system. He has, subsequent to his book, said that this is what he means, and so I will accept that he just doesn't know what the word Darwinian means in any sensible way. The third option is to say that regardless of mechanisms, some irreducibly complex systems can evolve and some cannot. The first option is defeated by just noting that there are non-Darwinian in the strict sense processes. The third option is unfalsifiable, and so not even a hypothesis. It can just be ignored, because it basically boils down to the claim that evolution should be rejected unless the claimant is omniscient. That's not how science, or anything else in life, really operates. This leaves us with the second option, as the only actual version of irreducible complexity that makes a non-trivial and testable scientific claim. So, how do we test this claim? Well, we simply see if there are any irreducibly complex systems that have observably evolved, or any even possible mechanisms for such systems to evolve. Turns out, we've done both. An example I got from one Dr. Dan of Creation Myths is the HIV protein BPU, which evolved from the chimpanzee simian immunovirus in historical times, and in the main pandemic strain evolved that protein into an irreducibly complex system for antagonizing human tetherin, a protein used in the immune system of monkeys broadly, but which is in humans highly divergent, preventing infection of humans by simian immunoviruses. Well, until HIV, that is. Further, in 2007, the paper Stepwise Formation of the Bacterial Flagellar System by Renyi Liu and Howard Auckman was published, which described exactly what Behe said was impossible, the stepwise evolutionary path of the bacterial flagellum. And remember, the claim was that such a thing was impossible, so even if the evolution as put forward by Liu and Auckman isn't exactly what happened, that doesn't matter. That it's possible at all defeats the whole of the irreducible complexity argument. So the only version of irreducible complexity that means anything has been falsified in both ways it could have been, meaning it just isn't a barrier to evolution.
And Ken Miller and other so-called critics of this will try and say they have a precursor to this, but they really don't.
They do. It's a type 3 secretion system, which is even more widely distributed phylogenetically, is significantly simpler, and is coded for by homologous genes even in bacteria with both a flagellum and a type 3 secretion system. They even both use the same catalysis of adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate in their respective rotary action. Basically, if you stick a tail coming out of a type 3 secretion system complex, you get a very basic flagellum. Granted, it's way less efficient than the modern flagellum, but that's kind of to be expected since the modern flagellum has been evolving for billions of years.
They don't have a functional precursor to this.
Tell that to all the people who ever had a salmonella infection, because the precursor to the flagellum is quite effective in salmonella in terms of allowing the bacterium to infect human hosts by injecting them with proteins via that very precursor. The fact that you can't eat raw chicken is in large part because of the hydria function of that very precursor.
In fact, when you look at this, if this isn't something engineered, I don't know what is.
A quick way to tell is if it has this kind of function, but it has no way to reproduce. See, an actual outboard motor on a boat doesn't come from a genetic code. It isn't related to anything genetically, and so it's engineered. I hope this helps with the confused people in the back who think that my computer or internet connection should evolve, despite not meeting the minimum criteria for evolution.
You've got a propeller, you've got bushings with L-rings, P-rings, you've got membranes, hooks, universal joints, you've got a rotor with an S-ring and an M-ring, you've got studs, a stator, you've got all this stuff, which is really an engineered creation. It's not something that could come into existence.
Except that it can. We know how it can. We can see the genes that were duplicated. We have the homologous proteins in other bacteria as well as in bacteria that do have the flagellum. Some bacterial flagella are missing some of the components he's so impressed by, and they still function. This is no different to the face on Mars. It looks like something a human might have made if you squint and look at it in just the right light, and you pretend that the missing data isn't actually missing data, but part of the image.
And
Can you define irreducible complexity for us so we see why this is so critical to the Darwinian enterprise?
an irreducibly complex system or creation, whatever it is, whatever you're talking about,
System is the right word.
has to have all the parts in working order at the right place at the right time in order to have function.
And it has to be the case that the removal of any one part of the system will cause it to cease functioning.
The illustration that Michael Behe gives is the mousetrap, right?
Which is hilariously dumb. It's trivially easy to remove various parts of a mousetrap and have it remain functional. For instance, the base can be removed, and the parts simply attached to the floor, and the bait can be removed. And while this will mean fewer mice are caught, it will still catch some.
You've got to have all 5 parts of the mousetrap there in order to catch mice.
No.
Yeah, you could have a precursor to a mousetrap, but it wouldn't catch mice if you took some of the parts away.
Disregarding the fact that for at least some of the parts that's not true, so what? Time for a vocabulary lesson. There's this thing called exaptation. It's where you take a structure that evolved from one function and then use it for a relatively unrelated function for which it works well enough. For example, feathers on early dinosaurs didn't really help at all with aerodynamics or flight, but they were great for display and thermoregulation. But as some dinosaurs started spending more time doing things like jumping from tree to tree, the feathers were right there to take on an aerodynamic function. Similarly, the lever arm of a mousetrap can work as a tie clip, or any kind of clip really. It can then be exapted to work as a weapon against mouse spines.
You need to have all the parts there in working order together at the same time in order to have function. Do you have a different definition?
No, it's just because the Darwinian model requires that each piece be added little by little, and at each stage you have increased functionality.
Yes.
With irreducible complexity, you have functionality at no stage of the building of the thing until you have the whole thing built. So when you have a bona fide irreducibly complex feature in the biological realm, there is no Darwinian way to explain how the pieces get assembled to the functional state.
That's not entirely accurate.
Let's go into one of my favorite examples of evolution in general, and exaptation, the notothenioid icefish. Notothenioid fish, like all vertebrates, have a pancreas, and in that pancreas there's a protein called trypsinogen. It's a protein that's vital for the digestion of other proteins, but we're not talking about trypsinogen per se. You see, trypsinogen, like all proteins, is coded for by a gene, and like any gene, it can undergo mutations, including duplication and partial duplication. One partial duplication of this gene had a further mutation which caused it to inhibit the formation of ice crystals, something trypsinogen does not do. Boom, these fish now had a higher resistance to cold water. That's not a Darwinian mechanism, but it's certainly evolution. This antifreeze glycoprotein was not preceded by a less efficient antifreeze protein that evolved stepwise to get better and better function. It was accepted from a digestive enzyme precursor directly into an antifreeze protein.
And what guys like Miller want to say is that there must be some functionality to the preliminary states that then leads you to this final sophisticated state we see here.
But that's not true either. Now we get to talk about orphan genes, or taxonomically restricted genes. These are genes that arise in restricted fashion in a taxon, and are not homologous with any gene outside that taxon. That seems like a problem for evolution, except when you look more into it, you find that it's not. You see, while you don't find homologous genes, you do find homologous genetic sequences outside the taxon with the orphan gene. Orphan genes are generally the result of a process called neofunctionalization. If a non-gene portion of a genome gains the ability to be transcribed and ultimately turned into a protein, that protein may have or gain biochemical activity in the cell, which can then be selected for. This is something that happens all over the tree of life. Evolution doesn't need to start with any function at all.
But of course, there must be only if you're presuming the materialistic explanations.
Nope. Materialism, which isn't required for evolution, in no way precludes completely novel function from evolving.
If you're going with the evidence as we're facing it, we are free then to just deposit the most obvious explanation: this is designed.
It's not obvious that this is designed except by appealing to human intuition, but human intuition sucks. Human intuition says that the Earth is flat and stationary, that heavy things fall faster than light things, and that time always goes at the same rate everywhere, and that the speed of objects can be arbitrarily high. None of this is true.
They are not free to do that because they are restricted by their philosophical presuppositions, so they have to demand that there must be some functionality to these prior stages, and this is the demand that they force upon the argument.
Nope, there is no demand for prior function. Prior function is often evident in various systems, especially since once a system arises de novo, such as in orphan genes or through exaptation, further refinements are possible, but it is not required to explain current function in all cases. In fact, I previously mentioned the VPU protein in HIV, and how in the pandemic strain it antagonizes human tetherin. VPU in the chimpanzee simian immunovirus does not antagonize tetherin at all, whether chimp or human. Without any of the multiple mutations that allow for VPU to antagonize human tetherin, it doesn't antagonize any tetherin at all. They all have to be in place at once or the function simply does not occur. This protein is by itself irreducibly complex, and yet we know it evolved in historical times, because there was no HIV not that long ago, and because we can tell through genome sequencing how long it has been since it diverged from the broader chimpanzee version of the virus.
To disqualify the conclusions of irreducible complexity.
There are no meaningful conclusions of irreducible complexity that have stood up to scrutiny, and not because of any evolutionary assumptions, but because we've seen irreducibly complex systems arise in evolution without an evident designer.
Now, a conclusion of an irreducibly complex system is what Michael Behe takes, because he wrote the book on this, and here's what he says. He says the result of these cumulative efforts to investigate the cell, to investigate life at the molecular level, is a loud, clear, piercing cry of design.
I would argue the opposite. At the molecular level, cells are very often overly complex in Rube Goldbergian ways, often to the detriment of the cells. There is no reason for the mammalian blood clotting cascade to be so convoluted and prone to error. The same is true with the ridiculously over-complex photosynthesis pathways in plants. It's hard to see how any sane entity would design life the way it is. If life was the design of a god, that god must be a god of madness.
The result is so unambiguous and so significant that it must be ranked as one of the greatest achievements in the history of science. The discovery rivals those of Newton and Einstein. Now,
talk about self-congratulation. Maybe someone should tell him that that level of masturbatory self-indulgence is best left in private, especially when it's so obviously undeserved.
Is he just seeing what he wants to see?
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. We can tell because when he was confronted with the research that he said didn't exist in court, he admitted to not having seen it. Why is that? It was available to him. Oh yeah, it's because he didn't want to see anything contrary. Because this was never about science, it was never about gaining knowledge, it was about propping up his theological commitments that were made for non-scientific reasons.
I'll let you decide that.
Nah, let the court system decide that, because they already did. And yeah, he is only seeing what he wants to see.
Science doesn't say anything, scientists do. I think he's drawing the proper conclusion based on the evidence, but that's for you to decide.
I mean, it was also for Bush-appointed Judge John Jones to decide, and he decided that intelligent design, including Behe's irreducible complexity argument, wasn't science, which is also what the rest of biology has decided. I guess you're free to conclude otherwise, but I think it's telling that when tested both in the literature and in the courts, the idea has been laughed out of the room.
Question.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
You
want me to go back there?
There is, it's not unusual to hear people say that Behe has been completely refuted on this point.
In a similar way that it is not uncommon for people to say that the flat Earth has been completely refuted.
And when you look at the details, what you discover is that someone has taken an example of alleged irreducible complexity, and then they have contrived an explanation, and it may be a clever explanation that is worth looking into. I'm not dismissing it. But they've contrived an explanation how that particular piece of machinery can be explained by some kind of step-by-step process in which each step has functionality.
It's a possibility, but it's not evident.
But that's the thing. We don't need evidence, even though we have it. All we need is the possibility. Because Behe's argument is that there is no such possibility, so showing that there is means the argument fails. Let's give an example. Suppose someone says to me that it's impossible to learn Coptic because it's an old dead language and there are more or less no study materials in English available. I don't actually need to learn Coptic in order to show that this claim is false. I can point out that Coptic priests who are fluent in English are available as potential tutors, that there are learning materials in other languages which I could learn first as a stepping stone to Coptic, and that translations of Coptic texts into English are also available for me to check my translations on. Taken together, this means that while it might be very difficult for me to learn Coptic, it's at least possible, and so the claim that it is impossible is false, whether or not I actually go ahead and learn Coptic. In case you're wondering, I do think it would be a cool language to study, but no, I'm not studying it. Because of lack of resources, and because I really don't feel like trying to find a Coptic priest who would tutor someone. Similarly, with Behe, the claim is that such systems are impossible for evolution. That means that any even hypothetically possible pathway for their evolution defeats the entire argument, in the only form that matters. It seems that what Kukul is doing here is attempting to fall back on the third version of the irreducible complexity argument, that some irreducibly complex systems can evolve, but not all of them. But again, this isn't a testable hypothesis short of at least one person being omniscient. This just boils down to someone saying, yeah, okay, sure, maybe this isn't a barrier to evolution, but what if sometimes, unpredictably, it is? My response to that is, yeah, that's cool, I don't care, that's not a scientific claim, and we're talking about science.
Well, it's a possibility, and that's okay because scientists have to do that. That's part of what they do. They tell stories and then try to find evidence that that things played out the way they think they do.
No, that's almost the exact opposite of what at least good scientists do. Instead, they try to look for evidence that they're wrong. Finding evidence that you're right is trivially easy in most cases. The very fact that you suspect you're right in the first place probably means that there are things you take as evidence of your rightness. Science needs to know if you're wrong, and that's where the challenge is. If your idea has no way to show that it's wrong, then your idea probably has no place in science. And if you're doing science, you need to be trying to show that you're wrong. Only when you fail, as do others, can we make a reasonable inference that you're probably right. Evolution has failed to be shown wrong over and over again. That's why it's the reigning theory in biology.
So I'm not faulting the process. I'm making a little different point. Let's even just say, for the sake of discussion, that they have done a convincing job of giving us a materialistic explanation to demonstrate that one alleged example of irreducible complexity is not, in fact, irreducibly complex. But then they take that to be a refutation of the entire point and every example of irreducibly complex machines in the biological realm.
Yup, because that's how basic logic works, and in the words of Sirach of Vulcan, logic is the beginning of wisdom. Sorry, Greg Kukul, who earlier was championing logical thought, has now just abandoned it when it seems to work against him. It's like he's trying to do everything humanly possible to make sure that that bit of respect he earned away at the beginning of this is squandered. It's honestly kind of sad.
I've seen this time and time again. Oh, he's been completely disproved.
Yep.
How so? Well, because this flagellum thing, well, we found a way to explain that in Darwinian terms. So, there he goes. As if the flagellum is the only example of an irreducibly complex thing.
It doesn't matter if it is or not. The argument has the following form. Premise 1, no irreducibly complex system can evolve. Premise 2, irreducibly complex systems are present in life. Conclusion, evolution cannot account for evident features of living things. If either premise is shown false, the conclusion is shown false. Now, I won't argue that irreducibly complex things do not exist, but by showing that any irreducibly complex system can evolve, it means that the premise is not true, and so the argument is not sound. Kukul wants us to change the argument. His preferred version is this. Premise 1. Some irreducibly complex systems cannot evolve. Premise 2. Irreducibly complex systems are present in life. Conclusion. Evolution cannot account for the evident features of living things. But the problem is that while the original argument was valid, it was not sound. This argument isn't even valid. The conclusions do not follow. It has the same form as this argument. Premise 1. Some birds have webbed feet. Premise 2. Pigeons are birds. Conclusion. Pigeons have webbed feet. Even if all the premises are true, this argument fails. It's flatly fallacious.
And as B.E. points out, and the people in the field know, the biological realm is absolutely littered with these kinds of things. In every single cell you see these kinds of things. And just in the replication process of the DNA and how the DNA helps make proteins, assemble proteins, there's all kinds of little machines that are involved in that process. And by explaining away one of the machines in this vast array of them, you have not defeated the argument of irreducible complexity.
You have, though. Now, what you haven't done is demonstrate that every irreducibly complex system could have evolved. The thing is, though, that if any of them couldn't have, it's not strictly because of irreducible complexity. There has to be some other reason for the impossibility of the evolution of these systems. If you think that some particular irreducibly complex system couldn't evolve, that's great. Figure out why it couldn't. And present that argument. But simply noting that it's irreducibly complex isn't enough. Because we know that on its own, that isn't a barrier to evolution. I'll try an analogy. Suppose your friend decides to tell you that he's moving to Antarctica. And you say that he shouldn't do that because he'll die in the cold. All your friend has to do to overcome this objection is point out that many people manage to live in Antarctica despite the cold, by doing things like having heaters indoors and special insulating clothing, and that this is shown to be sufficient to protect from all known temperatures in the region of Antarctica he plans to move to. That's it. The cold isn't a problem for him. It's been accounted for. Now, does that mean there's no reason he shouldn't move there? No, of course not. What about food, power, etc.? These are separate but serious problems, and if he has no solution to them, then the fact that he might not freeze to death doesn't matter, because starving to death is also a pretty big problem with moving to Antarctica. Similarly, if Greg wants to argue that even if the flagellum is irreducibly complex and can evolve, that, say, cilium motion cannot, that's fine. But he needs another reason other than that it's irreducibly complex. Until he gives one, there's no reason to listen to him whine about this.
You've just removed supposedly one example of irreducible complexity.
You know, William Dembski makes the point that the irreducible complexity argument on steroids is the origin of life.
Which is not the same topic as evolution. Granted, there is overlap in the theoretical framework. For example, natural selection probably began operating long before the first life, but still, whether or not the origin of life is plausible without an intelligent, purposeful agent intervening is not the same question as, is the theory of evolution as currently understood a good explanation for the diversity and features of life as we now see it, and in the fossil record, and is universal common ancestry a good model within that framework?
Because for the origin of life, you need a cell.
That's going to depend on what we mean by a cell. I don't think that the first life had to have all the minimal features we associate with cells necessarily.
You need DNA.
No, you absolutely do not. You need some genetic material, but RNA will work, and can form spontaneously in prebiotically relevant ways.
You need RNA.
That seems probable. He's 1 for 3 now.
And you need proteins.
Hey, 2 for 4. Still enough, but at least it's not all wrong. The convenient thing about RNA is that RNA can form proteins all by itself. It doesn't need any other structures. So the first life could have been as simple as RNA inside a phospholipid bilayer membrane producing small proteins directly with the RNA. That's barely a cell at all, and yet that could very well undergo evolution, metabolize, and reproduce.
And all 4 of those things need one another.
Incorrect. RNA does not need proteins, nor does it need DNA, and a cell certainly doesn't need DNA.
They have to all be there together to have any of them in a living thing.
Again, no, they don't.
DNA needs RNA, RNA needs DNA, a cell needs both of them, proteins need, they all go together. It's a classic chicken and egg problem.
No, it just seems that way because when we look at life now, billions of years of evolution later, that's how those things work. But we know that chemically they didn't have to work that way. So they didn't have to start that way. In fact, that's kind of the same thing with the chicken and the egg problem. Today we see chickens lay eggs and chickens hatch from eggs in what is, to our limited perspective, an endless cycle with no obvious beginning or end. But we happen to know that chickens evolved long after the evolution of the amniote egg, and so the egg came first and by millions of years. If you want to know about the past, you can't simply look at the status quo now and then project that back in time indefinitely. You have to actually look at the past and look at what is possible, not just what is currently occurring.
I mean, that's the irreducible complex problem on steroids. That's why even Dawkins will just speculate on the beginning, the origin of life.
No, that's not why. The reason is that origin of life research is still in the early days, and we have few firm conclusions from it as a result. It's not because of some pretend irreducibility problem with rage issues. If a part of science is actively being researched, then that means that that part of science currently has unknowns, and that there will be arguments about potential solutions to the problems presented by those unknowns. That's a sign of a healthy, thriving, and active field of science. Pick any bit of now well-established science, and there was a time when it was not well-established. And the kinds of disagreements and uncertainty that we see now in the origin of life research were characteristic of that part of science too.
But then when you look at how life functions here, and you're trying to reverse engineer things, interesting word, reverse engineer.
No, it's not at all interesting that the guy emotionally invested in living things being designed would speak as if they're designed.
Right? This stuff's engineered. You're trying to figure out how is it put together by randomness.
No, because for what feels like the millionth time, evolution is not simply characterized by randomness. Selection is not random, and it's a very important part of evolution. Look, this is a Julia set. It's a kind of fractal. It has two numbers that define the shape, one real number and one imaginary number. There are infinite Julia sets, and each one is defined by the seed numbers, which can be random, but each random set of seed numbers will give you exactly one Julia set. And the same seed numbers will always give you the same Julia set. Infinite complexity and sublime order can come from randomness, if the randomness is simply a source on which a non-random force acts. In the case of the Julia set, it's a function that is applied to the numbers chosen. In evolution, it's the selection acting on the mutations that arise in a probabilistic way.
I think ultimately it's futile to try and figure that out because it doesn't appear to be put together by randomness.
Well, no one is asking Frank Turek to figure out how the origin of life on Earth occurred. I'm just asking that he stop pretending evolution isn't true, and that there's no value in finding out more in the field of the origin of life research. Maybe he's right, and there is no naturalistic way for life to come into existence. But the only way we could know that is by trying all the naturalistic possibilities. We won't figure that out by basing it on what would be most convenient for our other beliefs.
Now, by the way, before we go into the fossil record, last thing. Can you continue to look for a natural cause for life? Yeah, you can continue to look for it if you want to.
Which many scientists want to do and are doing.
But when does a question become closed? At what point do you finally say, look, we've been looking long enough?
When the people who are looking give up. Really, that's it. As long as there are people interested to keep looking, and people interested enough in the research to fund it, then it's reasonable to keep going. It's not like origin of life researchers are mugging Turek on the street to pay for their chemicals or lab equipment. What does he care?
When are we going to finally say information doesn't appear to have any natural cause?
Never, because we have already found natural causes for information, and doing so was extremely easy, and was done before we even really had a formal system of information theory.
Natural forces, all the natural forces we know just create repetitive things over and over again.
What is he talking about? What does that mean? I would absolutely not characterize natural forces that way.
When are we going to finally admit that there's got to be intelligence introduced somewhere, somehow, in this process?
When that actually becomes something with evidence behind it, and a falsifiable model that fails to be falsified despite the best efforts of scientists.
When every knee will bow.
Huh?
When every knee will bow.
When every knee will bow, maybe. That's it. I don't know.
Yes, sure, maybe when and if various Christian eschatological scenarios come true.
But based on the information we have now, the best explanation is there was intelligence put in it at some point.
If the best information we have now is what Turek has been giving us, then I would have to say that he has in no way demonstrated that it's even a possibility, never mind the best explanation.
And can I underscore something?
Please.
That you implied here, and this is something that Stephen Meyer makes as a very, very strong point.
Hey, Stephen Meyer! That guy is a known hack who's so stupid he thinks that there were no animals before the Cambrian and that mammals didn't show up until the Eocene. Here's my video about him if you're interested.
The task here isn't just looking around a little bit longer to see if we can find the right stuff. It has to do with the nature of the Enterprise itself.
The Enterprise was a 23rd century Federation Constitution-class starship operated by Starfleet. It was constructed at the San Francisco Fleet Yards and was one of the most storied ships in Starfleet history, causing the organization to name at least 7 other ships after her, each gaining a letter from the Latin alphabet appended to the original NCC 1701 registry to indicate their lineage, as well as how many ships preceded them. The last known Enterprise is the Enterprise F, a Neo-Constitution ship, originally the USS Titan A. It was under the command of Captain 7 of 9, also known as Annika Hansen, when last seen. An Enterprise J was seen as part of a temporal Cold War, but the status of this part of the timeline is unknown, and that timeline may never occur. So its existence is still mostly hypothetical.
Biochemical predestination is dead in the water.
If Greg says so, I'm not even sure what that means. I've never heard the phrase biochemical predestination. Sounds like something a Calvinist would come up with. Greg is a Calvinist, so I guess that checks out.
Because it can't produce information. They know that.
Well, spiritual phlebotomy can't create salvific grace, and Christians know that, so I guess we can dismiss Christianity.
So there's only a couple of avenues that the materialists can go.
I get so tired of pointing out that evolution, and now I'll add origin of life, does not require materialism, nor are all people involved in either field who just don't deny the science coming out of either field materialists in the philosophical sense.
That he has a disposal to explain information, and it turns out that the nature of information itself cannot be explained by those kinds of things.
That sounds like it would be a really interesting and compelling argument, if we had a good definition for information. Since of course we don't, and all proposed definitions that are scientifically useful and quantifiable show us that yes, information can arise from non-design, non-rational, and non-personal sources, I have a feeling that there is no actual argument here.
And so you run into a dead end not because I haven't yet found the little piece of information to explain it. It's because of the kinds of things that you're trying to bring together.
So could we say, Greg, in your opinion, that this is a category mistake?
Yes.
That it's not the God of the gaps argument anymore either, because nature itself can't explain immaterial realities known as
exactly.
Except that nothing about life requires material information. DNA and RNA are not immaterial. They are physically existing chemicals that undergo physical chemical interactions. They don't need to embody some ephemeral, non-material entity called information. They are a collection of electrons, neutrons, and protons arranged in particular ways that interact according to physical laws. There is no semantic content inherent to DNA that requires some conscious mind to either create or to understand it. It's chemistry. And remember back when Kugel said that analogies aren't evidence? Well, using analogies to human-created semantic content in the form of stories or books or whatever isn't evidence that the chemicals of life need a mind to come into being or for evolution to occur. If he wants to leave information as some vague, undefined, non-material thing, then guess what? There's no evidence DNA has any such information. By that definition, the information content of DNA can be said to be exactly zero, and life doesn't need or have any information apart from in the mind of sufficiently cognitively capable animals, like humans and some Ceratosaurus.
Okay.
You're trying to find a materialistic explanation for the existence of immaterial stuff, information.
No, I'm not, because there doesn't seem to be any such thing that needs to be accounted for.
Which your philosophy, first of all, can't explain how you get something immaterial from something material, but it also, your philosophy denies the existence of immaterial things to begin with.
That's right.
A philosophy that is not required by science or followed by many scientists, and again, there's no reason to think that this is something that must be explained in the first place.
So it's just in principle not capable of solving this problem.
Which would be troubling if we could show that there is such a problem.
But then, just like that, the atheist could be right. That's what he's famous for saying.
That's not me. That's Tom.
Was that Tom?
Yeah, that's Tom.
No, I think you're right on it. It's a different category.
Yeah, but it's not scientists who are making the category error. It's these guys.
It's like trying to find a natural cause for all of nature. Trying to find a natural cause for information when we know information's immaterial.
Not everything that occurs in nature seems to have a cause. Spontaneous, apparently uncaused events are all over particle physics. Maybe the natural world neither has nor requires an identifiable cause. Maybe it does. Maybe that cause is God. Maybe it's not. No answer to that question matters a bit for evolution.
Last thing, fossil record. Again, we interpret the data via philosophy.
Not any more than anything else in science, but maybe that's the point Turek is making.
Let's go back to Stephen Jay Gould.
Possibly the most misquoted scientist besides Darwin in all of young Earth creationist discourse.
Perhaps one of the more famous evolutionists who died about 10 years ago, he taught at Harvard, he said this: modern multicellular animals make their first uncontested appearance in the fossil record some 570 million years ago, and with a bang, not a protracted crescendo.
That little audio glitch is in the original. I didn't do that.
This Cambrian explosion marks the advent, at least into direct evidence, of virtually all the major groups of modern animals.
By which he means the phyla.
And all within the minuscule span, geologically speaking, of a few million years. In other words,
the Cambrian was more than 53 million years long. It's not what I'd call a few million years. But then, this is Gould making a rhetorical point against gradualism in favor of his own idea of punctuated equilibrium. So he's exaggerating the supposed shortness of the Cambrian to drive home that point.
There are fewer phyla now than there were at the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah, extinction is a well-known phenomenon.
Exactly opposite to what you think with regard to Darwinism.
How so? Something in an extant phylum can't evolve into a new phylum. Because remember, the history of life is an append-only ledger. If your ledger contains a phylum like Chordata, Arthropoda, Onychophora, or Porifera, you don't get to replace it. On the other hand, if say all roundworms went extinct, then that would mean that the phylum Nematoda has gone extinct. Phylum isn't a special taxon that means something. It's just a very large taxon in most cases, and the common ancestors of the various taxa lived in most cases even before the Cambrian, or at the very earliest part of it. A very important part of evolution is the increase in diversity over time. This means that when you look back in time, organisms in what are now very different groups begin to look more and more like each other. And into the future, the modern descendants of a single species could be wildly different. At the time when the phyla were diverging, it would have looked to an observer just the same as the divergence between closely related animals today, like between wolves and foxes. But as these groups went on to evolve separately, these originally minor changes that separated, for example, Arthropoda from Onychophora or Chordata from Hemichordata became deep divides among extant organisms. New phyla fundamentally can't evolve because there's no such thing as a phylum, and all the phyla have already evolved. Even if we discover a new animal different enough from any known organisms to warrant placing it in a new phylum, that phylum would have evolved hundreds of millions of years ago anyway. For example, the phylum Loricifera was only discovered in 1983. Its closest relatives seem to be the penis worms and another obscure group called the Chinorhyncha, but the common ancestor of all those phyla would have to be at the latest in the early Cambrian, because by the middle Cambrian, the preapulids, or penis worms, are known to exist. So it's not that a new phylum evolved, it's just that we didn't have fossils for these microscopic, soft-bodied little guys. Frank clearly lacks a fundamental grasp on taxonomy and evolution if he thinks evolution would predict new phyla evolving continuously and would not predict the extinction of phyla.
Here is a clip from Darwin's Dilemma, which is a phenomenal DVD. If you guys don't have it, I think we may have some back at the house. We'll bring them in. Take a look at this clip. This explains the Cambrian explosion very quickly.
I have a strong feeling it will do no such thing, but okay.
But late in the Precambrian, they disappeared from the Earth.
The they there is the Ediacaran or Vendian biota, apparently, which includes things like Charnia, Wiwaxia, Anomacalathus, Dickinsonia, and their friends.
Then, long after their extinction, everything changed in a geological instant.
It's actually not clear how long after the extinction of the various forms known from the Ediacaran that organisms typical of the early Cambrian came on the scene. It may well be that the earliest members of Cambrian groups appeared on the scene before this extinction, and may have even caused it. Why are we building a morellomorph out of individual parts like a model kit? What does that represent? It's certainly not how evolution works. Also, yes, I'm interrupting pretty frequently in order to not have to do horrible things to the audio to get rid of the music. And also to not get a copyright claim on this video.
In a spectacular burst of creativity, the basic blueprints for most of the animal kingdom exploded into being.
What does that mean? In that little montage we saw a radiodont, a bivalve arthropod, a morellomorph, and a lobopodium. All are panarthropods, which are segmented organisms with bilateral symmetry, a cuticle that grows a protective layer that must be shed periodically to allow for growth, and paired appendages on each segment, usually called legs, in their most generic form. All rely at least in part on hydraulic pressure for some aspects of leg movement, all have an internal one-way digestive tract, all have a body cavity with repeated organs, and all have an open circulatory system. It seems like this is all one basic body plan, even if we are looking at three separate phyla. Or maybe just having the cuticle, through gut, and the body cavity is the body plan, and we can add other animals which form the group Ecdysozoa, along with the penis worms and the aforementioned Chinorhynchans and the nematodes. Is that a single body plan? It turns out that body plan really doesn't mean anything. It's just an arbitrary label we put on some arbitrary groupings of animals that humans think are similar enough to count as having the same body plan, but not so dissimilar that they don't seem to have the same body plan.
And for the first time, biologically complex structures like compound eyes, spinal cords, articulated limbs, and skeletons appeared on Earth.
That is incorrect. The first skeletons appeared before the Cambrian, with the so-called small shelly fauna. As for articulation in limbs, I guess it depends on what you mean. If you just mean sticky outy bits on either side of a bilaterally symmetrical body, then I would argue that Eulingia, a segmented worm from before the Cambrian, would count. If it just means limbs with joints, then yeah, that's just a thing that evolved along with the skeleton and isn't really a separate feature.
To understand the speed of the Cambrian explosion, imagine the history of life compressed into a single day.
Sure, why not? I wonder if Greg Kugel will speak up and object that since this is just an analogy, it's not an argument. I rather doubt it.
If we imagine the whole history of life on Earth taking place in one 24-hour period...
Oh hey, it's Jonathan Wells, the guy who thinks some random dead guy from Korea is the returned Jesus Christ and that his wife was herself a divine being. You know, until they divorced. Oops.
The current standard estimates for the origin of life put it at about 3.8 billion years ago, let's say 4 billion.
Given that the whole of the Cambrian is less than 600 million years ago, I actually do object to rounding 3.8 billion to 4 billion, as that's a pretty significant difference when we're already working on a timescale of tens of millions of years.
So if we start the clock then, our 24-hour clock, 6 hours, nothing but these simple single-celled organisms appear.
Wait, I thought single-celled organisms were fantastically complex. Now Wells is telling me that they're simple and no big deal. Creationists can't be consistent for the life of them. This is exactly when that fabulous complexity in cells is arising.
The same sort that we saw in the beginning.
No, this is a period in which many evolutionary innovations are occurring in areas like modes of metabolism, the complexity of proteins, the divisions into major groups of modern organisms like Biconta and Uniconta and Obozoa, Holozoa, etc. This is not simple stasis. The fact that life at this point was still unicellular doesn't in any way mean things weren't changing. That ignores the vast diversity within single-cell life.
12 hours, same thing.
Same thing being huge increases in diversity and complexity in single-celled organisms. Cool.
18 hours, same thing.
Same thing being huge increases in diversity and complexity in single-celled organisms. Cool.
3/4 of the day has passed, and all we have are these simple, single-celled organisms.
I'm still amazed that single-celled life is simple and no big deal when creationists find that handy, and amazingly, mind-blowingly complex when they find that handy. It can't be both, creationists.
Then at about the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, boom, most of the major animal forms appear in the form that they currently have.
Oh yeah? That's interesting. This is Pikaia, one of the earliest identifiable chordates. That's the kind of thing you are. Do you think this looks like a modern form as chordates exist now? I sure don't. With very few exceptions, our earliest members of modern phyla from the Cambrian do not look anything like modern members of the same phylum. Here's Tenoimbricata, a member of the phylum Echinodermata, which includes today the sea cucumbers, sea stars, and sea urchins. Does it look like any of those? No, obviously not.
In the present. And many of them persist to the present, and we have them with us today.
The phyla? Yeah, they do. The species? Not at all.
Less than 2 minutes out of a 24-hour period. That's how sudden the Cambrian explosion was.
Okay, sure, that's not an argument.
I love that illustration because I think it brings it right down to home. 2 minutes at about 9 o'clock at night or 9:30 at night.
Brings what home? An approximately accurate look at the relative timescales of periods of this history of life? When should the phyla appear to make it seem plausible to Frank, and why? We don't know, and he isn't telling us. That whole thing was just a big Ecclesiastes 1-2.
Gould went on to say this, that it does not support gradualism.
Exactly, but that's not the same as saying it doesn't support evolution. Because remember, Gould wasn't arguing against evolution, he was proposing new mechanisms for evolution, and using the pattern of the fossil record as part of his case. Citing Gould as if he thought evolution wasn't true is lying about him, which is especially shitty given that he is not even here to defend himself, although to be fair, he did do so while he was still alive.
And the history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism.
But not inconsistent with evolution.
Here's what he said. Stasis, most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. And then he goes on to say sudden appearance. In other words, they come together all at once, fully formed.
No, that's not what it means. It means that the period of morphological change is relatively brief on a geological timescale compared to the period of relative morphological stability. And so that change is not likely to be captured in the fossil record, which would be pretty obvious if Turek read Gould, which by citing him, he's telling us he has. So either Turek is lying about Gould, lying about having read Gould, or is just so colossally stupid that he can't even read Gould's work written for lay audiences and understand them. None of those options reflect well on Turek.
So that's exactly the opposite of what we would say Darwinism is.
I guess kinda, but then earlier Turek was just using Darwinism seemingly as a synonym for the whole theory of evolution, and it's not at all the opposite of what we'd expect. The theory of evolution as a whole doesn't give a single prediction for how much morphological change we should see between closely related species, which is what Gould is talking about in context. That's something that's highly contingent.
They come in immediately and they leave immediately and they don't change as long as they're here on Earth.
Actually, no. The claim was that they don't change much, and that the change tends not to be directional, which is not the same as not changing. Plus, this pattern is not true of all species. That's why we have what are called chronospecies, that is, species that smoothly transition one into another through the geological column. The most ubiquitous are the various shelly phytoplankton, like coccolithophores, but there are also macroscopic animals that fit the bill too, such as the various species of the aquatic sloth genus Thalassocnus, or the species of the genus Triceratops. These exhibit the exact gradual and directional change that Gould said did not typify the fossil record.
Another quick clip from Darwin's Dilemma. Check this out.
I'd rather not, but oh well.
Imagine a graph, if you will, of the appearance over time of phyla.
Okay, I'd expect, based on evolution, for there to be a spike near the beginning of multicellular life, then for it to drop off quite quickly, because all phyla are the groups that evolved early on.
In Darwin's picture, you'd have 1, then 2, then 4 perhaps, then 8.
No, that's not how it works. That's ignoring fundamentally what evolution is and why it is that ranks such as phyla are arbitrary. This is actually the opposite of what evolution would predict, unlike what Gould is talking about.
A gradually increasing curve of the number of phyla growing over time.
Nope, because as you go forward in time, the actual pattern is that you go lower in the taxonomic ranking. So you'd expect that after the spike and fall off in phyla, there would be the evolution of the modern subphyla, with no new phyla. Phyla are just early diverging clades. We're not early. If we're not early, then the divergence isn't likely to get put at the phylum rank, so no new phyla are expected, because all the divergence is happening within already established phyla. Because as I keep saying, the history of the evolution of any lineage is an append-only ledger. You can't take out an already in-place phylum entry to replace it with a new one.
What you actually have in the fossil record is a sudden spike in the number of phyla that appear during the Cambrian, and then a few that trickle in across the rest of geologic time.
Remember when I said this? Okay, I'd expect, based on evolution, for there to be a spike near the beginning of multicellular life, then for it to drop off quite quickly, because all phyla are the groups that evolved early on. Yeah, exactly. That is what evolution predicts, as long as you actually understand what taxonomy is.
This kind of discontinuity is radically at odds with the Darwinian picture of the history of life.
What discontinuity? That's just what it looks like when you have evolution going along as expected, but you decide to only look at one arbitrary taxonomic rank with no particular objective meaning. This so-called problem is just an artifact of how humans talk about the classification of organisms. The fact that human conventions don't entirely map onto the actual history of life isn't a problem for evolution. No matter how much human convention in biology fails to match the reality of biology, it doesn't affect the reality of biology one bit.
The pattern we see is the major body plans.
Major body plan is another thing that's not well defined, so this is another Ecclesiastes 1-2.
Present at the beginning.
Nope, because we have potential stem lineages before the Cambrian that seem to represent older divisions higher than what we would call the phyla. So this evolution goes even deeper into time before the evolution of what we now arbitrarily classify as phyla.
And that the organisms that we know today fall into one or another of those major body plans.
Yeah, because that's just how clades work. If you're descended from a member of a phylum, then you don't ever get to not be a member of that phylum. So it's fundamentally impossible for members of one phylum to evolve into members of a different or brand new phylum. At least not without redefining phylum in the first place.
They don't gradually increase over time.
What? The phyla? Of course they don't. If they did, it would be evidence of progressive creation, not evolution. Really, the Discovery Institute, which is who made this by the way, should hope to find brand new phyla popping up all over the place, especially large-bodied ones with hard parts. That would go a long way to defeating the theory of evolution. Dramatic music doesn't cover up the stupidity of all that we just saw.
So the fossil record does not support gradualism. It does not support Darwinism. You saw the spike there? I mean, that's how, according to the fossil record, these creatures have come into existence, just in spikes. The big spike, the Cambrian explosion, and then a couple of little spikes later on.
Yes, exactly as predicted by evolution. The earliest splits in the history of life were, get this now, early. Crazy, I know, but it's true.
But not this sort of progression from a few to many.
Right, not the thing that would provide evidence for progressive creation.
We'll stay with Gould here, who said this: the extreme rarity of the transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils.
Here's another thing Gould said. Quote, "It is infuriating to be quoted again and again by creationists, whether through design or stupidity, I do not know, as admitting that the fossil record includes no transitional forms. Transitional forms are generally lacking at the species level, but are abundant between larger groups." End quote. Weird how Turek isn't giving us that quote.
Let's go back to National Geographic.
I'd really rather not, but I guess we're doing it anyway.
I can't believe they put this in here. But this is a quote from the story. Here's what it says. Illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, I've never heard anyone, creationist or scientist, argue that the fossil record is complete or nearly so, which is the point being made here, the incompleteness of the fossil record.
Can you believe that?
Yes.
Can you imagine if you pay to go see a movie and they show you one frame of every 1,000? First of all, the movie's 12 seconds long. Do you walk out of there going, man, that was great. I got the plot. You would go, what?
Yeah, but if that's all that existed of a movie, then whatever, I get what I can get if I want any experience of the movie at all. And I'd at least know something. Like, I get a sense of who was in the movie, where it was likely set, and yes, I could probably figure out at least the broad outlines of the plot. Like, is it a haunted house movie, a gritty Vietnam War film, or a superhero movie, etc.?
Here's my question. What would the fossil record look like if intelligent design is true?
There's no way to tell, because intelligent design has no model, makes no predictions, and just whines about things being complicated. There's no coherent idea as to how ID proponents think the history of life works. Maybe it would look the same, maybe it would have a smooth increase in the number of phyla, maybe it wouldn't exist. Maybe there's no way to know because intelligent design boils down to saying, gee whiz, some things sure are neat. I guess that means God made them at some point, in some way, but I sure don't know how, or when, or why.
What would it look like?
Like it does.
I think like it does, right?
Maybe, but that just means that when it comes to the fossil record, intelligent design makes no novel predictions. And so, despite not being testably different from real science in terms of paleontology, it makes all sorts of extra assumptions, meaning that on the basis of paleontology, if ID predicts the current fossil record, it simply fails Occam's razor and should be ignored until we have reason to think its currently unnecessary extra assumptions actually are necessary.
Now, you could say every 1,000 might give you a progression if you fill in the gaps in your mind.
Or, you fill in the gaps with transitional species like all of these. One group of people who don't ignore the existence of actual fossils that have been found are my subscribers. So why not subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so that YouTube might someday let you know when I have new content? You know, if they feel like it. While you're there, please hit like so that YouTube can show my videos to people, you know, again, when they feel like it.
Right?
Right.
Or, and how are they filling in the gaps? They're filling in the gaps because we look like, say, other primates.
No, we're filling in gaps because we found morphological intermediates with a suite of characters that combines basal traits with derived traits, such that they're basal with respect to some known later creatures and derived with respect to known earlier creatures.
And they're assuming that there are transitions there.
I mean, only in the same way that I assume I'm writing the script, you know, because I notice myself doing it as I type it, or in the same way that you might assume that your house or apartment exists, you know, because chances are you're currently looking at it. Probably while you do some chores or use the bathroom. You know we have transitions because the transitional forms are right there, physically present for us to see and measure.
Well, that's the very question. They're assuming what they're trying to prove.
Nope, the existence of fossils isn't assumed, but they were predicted by evolution, and no one is trying to prove evolution any more than NASA is trying to prove the globe. We moved on from that a long time ago. Frank is welcome to try to disprove it, but he's just pissing into the wind. The wind on which the ship of trying to demonstrate evolution used to set sail nearly a century ago.
In fact, it's been said elsewhere, Jonathan Wells makes this point.
You think Wells pays Frank to service him like this? Or do you think Frank really just likes him this much?
You cannot make, and Michael Denton does too, you cannot make ancestral relationships or determine ancestral relationships from fossils anyway.
Kind of. It's a bit complex. In the case of individuals, that's certainly true. Except with extremely recent fossils, we can't make any determination about the genealogy of individuals, and without an extremely extensive fossil record for a certain lineage, we also generally can't support claims that one fossil species is directly ancestral to another fossil species. That's why when we do cladistic analysis on fossil taxa, we treat all of the species under consideration as terminal branches on the cladogram. We're much more likely to have found a sister group to the actual ancestor of a later species than the exact actually ancestral species. That being said, though, only descent with modification explains the objective nesting hierarchy that we see when we do run such analyses. So while we generally cannot make exact claims about ancestor-descendant relationships within the fossil record, it is still only compatible with descent with modification, meaning that it supports a universal common ancestry and gives negative evidence for separate ancestry.
You can't. 99%, Denton makes this point, 99% of what we know about a biological creature is in its soft tissue. It's not in its fossil remains.
Well, some fossils do include soft tissue, like this highly detailed fossil of Protoroctopus, or this famous fossil of Archaeopteryx, or this fossil of a hadrosaur named Leonardo. But yeah, paleontology has a lot of questions and a well-known problem of a lack of data for many taxa.
And so you can't even make ancestral connections by the fossil record.
I'm getting a bit tired of repeating myself, so here's me from the recent past. Kind of. It's a bit complex. In the case of individuals, that's certainly true. Except with extremely recent fossils, we can't make any determination about the genealogy of individuals, and without an extremely extensive fossil record for a certain lineage, we also generally can't support claims that one fossil species is directly ancestral to another fossil species. That's why when we do cladistic analysis on fossil taxa, we treat all of the species under consideration as terminal branches on the cladogram. We're much more likely to have found a sister group to the actual ancestor of a later species than the exact actually ancestral species. That being said, though, only descent with modification explains the objective nesting hierarchy that we see when we do run such analyses. So while we generally cannot make exact claims about ancestor-descendant relationships within the fossil record, it is still only compatible with descent with modification, meaning that it supports a universal common ancestry and gives negative evidence for separate ancestry.
But even when they try, they're out of ammunition, intellectual ammunition. Here's macroevolutionary theory. Watch this. Here's the true picture.
Wow, Turek has found out the well-known fact that the topology of all cladograms are provisional hypotheses. Congrats to him for understanding something I'd expect from a first-year undergrad in biology.
Now, there aren't missing links, there's a missing chain. If I have a link in New York, a link in Chicago, and a link in LA, do I have a missing chain or missing links?
Since chains are made up of links, if you have good reason to think that the links you have are from the same chain as a result of their characteristics, then you have missing links. We do have a good reason, based on both morphology and genetics, to think that we have a branching chain, and we have many, many of the links that were previously missing. But that means that the chances are the chains are real, and that the links really are missing. Turek is just going full-on Dr. Banjo.
If your elitist East Coast evolution is real, why has no one found the missing link between modern humans and ancient apes?
We did find it. It's called Homo erectus.
Then you have proven my case, sir. For no one has found the link between apes and this Homo erectus.
Yes, they have. It's called Homo habilis.
Aha! But no one has found the missing link between ape and the so-called Homo habilis.
Yes, they have. It's called Australopithecus africanus.
Oh, I've got you now. Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius macilli? Answer me that, Professor.
Oh. Okay, granted that one missing link is still missing. But just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Pshaw! Things don't exist simply because you believe in them. Thus saith the almighty creature in the sky!
I have a missing chain. There's no chain there.
Except that there is, because that's the only idea that both retrodicts and predicts successfully the pattern of taxonomy.
The basic body plan of the arthropod phylum has a segmented torso, jointed legs, and an exoskeleton.
And the basic body plan of the panarthropod, the bigger group to which arthropods belong, has unjointed legs, a protective outer covering, and segments. The basic body plan of the smaller group Crustacea includes a head tagma made up of multiple fused segments, complex mouth parts such as a labrum and mandibles, antennae, a middle tagma from which the locomotor legs extend, and an abdomen containing the anus and gonopores. Why should the middle one be the one we credit with the real body plan? Why not say that Crustacea is the basic body plan, or Arthropoda? Because it's arbitrary. That's why.
All of which arose suddenly at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion.
Except it didn't. Arthropods are preceded by stem arthropods like radiodonts, lobopodians, and opabinia.
And today we still see the continuity of this original plan, this foundational idea, in over 1 million species of animals.
Yeah, because that's how evolution works. It tinkers with what is already there. It doesn't start over from scratch like a designer can. That's why we can't see a continuous increase in phyla if evolution is true.
This top-down pattern looks nothing like the predictions of Darwin's theory.
I mean, except for the facts that it actually does, because just lying about what a phylum is doesn't actually do anything except show how dishonest you are. And that's all Meyer is doing.
Darwin's theory is that there's a tree of life.
Well, that's part of it, not all of it.
Where you have one organism diverging into many other organisms.
Right, so the common ancestor of all arthropods diverges into new types of arthropod, and then those types diverge into new subtypes. But you can't, by divergence, get outside of the descent from the common ancestor, meaning you can't ever leave Arthropoda if your ancestors are arthropods.
And big differences appearing at the top.
Except that they're not big differences at all. The first arthropods don't even have a hard exoskeleton, like Marella. They look much more like their stem arthropod cousins than they do like modern arthropods, specifically because they are more closely related to each other than two very divergent members of Arthropoda are today, say a spider and an isopod.
What we really see is from here up.
Is he saying we don't see any pre-phyla evolution? Because that's just flatly false. Just the existence of all these stem lineages means that's just not true.
This does not exist in the fossil record.
Yeah, unless you count all those stem arthropods, stem mollusks, and even probable stem bilaterians. I don't know why you wouldn't count them, since we have fossils of them. I guess you wouldn't count them because you don't want to. Because you're not concerned with truth, just maintaining your fundamentalist, evangelical, or tradcath, or Mooney identity. And you think this helps with that.
If I were using a botanical illustration, it would be a lawn.
You know, a botanical illustration isn't necessary, but okay. You think Wells knows that grass also branches, it just does it really close to the ground? Well, except for bamboo. But I don't think I'd describe bamboo as a lawn, so I'll give that a pass.
With separate blades of grass sprouting independently of each other.
Again, that's not really how grass usually works, but whatever.
And those would be the phyla. Now within each phylum, there is subsequent diversification.
So humans then are actually genetically related to chimpanzees and howler monkeys and tarsiers and lemurs and colugos and mice and lions and elephants and kangaroos and echidnas and lizards and frogs and carp and sharks and hagfish and sea squirts then. That's a whole heck of a lot of evolution, But of course, we know that he doesn't actually think that. He's using this ultimately to argue against human common ancestry with anything besides humans. It's just that this is an easy place to lie about biology, because his target audience doesn't really know about things like Panarthropoda, stem mollusca, Onychophora, or Morella. So they're unlikely to balk at any of the things he's saying.
But even there, I don't see the branches connecting that would make them a tree of life.
So he doesn't see branching within the phyla, even though he just said that he did? See what I mean here? There's no intelligent design model. What was the history of life actually like according to Wells? Well, there's no answer to that question. It's just one big fog bank of hazy, half-formed ideas.
Darwin was caught in the grip of a deep dilemma.
No one cares. Darwin was writing close to 2 centuries ago at this point. This is no more relevant than pointing out that Newton didn't have a theory of gravity is to the modern theory of general relativity. Darwin isn't the divine revelator of evolutionary theory. He's not the messiah of biology. He's not Rasul al-Ilm. He's just a guy who made some important discoveries a while back.
The fossil record showed him one thing, his theory told him something else.
Actually, if you read the section about the fossil record in all 6 editions of On the Origin of Species in order, you find that as time went, he felt less and less uncertain about the fossil record, and he lived to see vindication in new transitional forms like Archaeopteryx. But sure, if you cherry-pick, say, the first edition of Origin, then it sure does seem like that pesky fossil record was a problem for him. Of course, even if that were the case then, which it wasn't, it's certainly not the case now.
He comes to an impasse at this point, and he says, if this pattern holds, it is a genuine argument against my view.
Lucky for him, then, that it didn't.
And I think 150 years later, we've added a great deal more detail to the picture, but I think the basic problem is still unsolved.
I'm not even sure what the basic problem is supposed to be. Everything is as would be predicted by evolution.
Still unsolved.
What is the implication of this? Richard Dawkins will tell us. Here it is.
Maybe that was legible to the audience, but it's not legible to me.
Without gradualness, we are back to a miracle. That's why he went after Stephen Jay Gould, because Stephen Jay Gould came up with the punctuated equilibria theory, which said that evolution took these jumps. He had no mechanism by which he could show evidence for this, but he just said it must be.
Actually, he did propose mechanisms, such as the founder effect, new environments causing new selection pressures, and perhaps most significantly, population selection. Now, it turns out that the most important part of punctuated equilibrium, population selection, has been largely discarded, and the founder effect, as well as new environments leading to directional selection, aren't exactly all that new or unique to Gould. That being said, it remains the case that small populations evolve faster than large ones, and that while it's easy to say trace the evolution of mammals from basal synapsids, or of modern canines from basal so-called miacids, it's virtually impossible to trace through fossils the evolution of all the members of, say, genus Canis or Vulpes, from their common ancestor as a genus.
Why? Because philosophically, he's already decided evolution's true. So evolution wasn't gradual in his view, it took these hopeful monster jumps somehow.
Except that hopeful monster jumps are not what Gould was proposing. That's saltationism, and is again distinct from either gradualism or punctuated equilibrium. It is essentially the idea that occasionally huge morphological changes happen in a single generation. The classic example is a crocodile laying an egg out of which a bird hatches. This is not the evolution of a new but very similar species in an isolated population too fast to reliably leave a good fossil record, but still so slow as to leave parents and offspring very much alike. The fact that Turek can't distinguish between the very different ideas of punctuated equilibrium and saltation says far more about his ability to discuss evolution than anything he said so far about evolution itself.
No evidence for this.
See, I don't know if he means by this punctuated equilibrium or saltation, and while granted there's really no evidence of saltationism, or for things like species selection, I'm not sure why that's supposed to be a problem.
He's just backing his philosophy, or assuming his philosophy before he looks at the evidence.
Look, I'm not here to defend Dawkins' philosophical positions. I'm sure he and I would disagree on a lot of them. But I just have to point out the irony of someone who is willing to reject virtually all of science on the grounds that he has already assumed his particular interpretation of the Bible trumps all possible evidence, complaining about Dawkins. I think Frank missed his true calling as a movie theater projectionist.
And therefore comes up with that. Last thing from Dawkins here.
I hope that's true. I'm really tired of Dawkins.
We already read this earlier. He does have a philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism.
Cool, but I don't. Neither is required to study evolution for it to be true, so who cares? Dawkins isn't the king of biology. He's not Emir al-Ilm. His philosophy isn't mandatory for scientists or students. He's one guy who's pretty good at biology and absolutely atrocious at most other things. And, who has supported or at least failed to condemn some pretty heinous stuff and is a bigot. I don't care about Dawkins. He has never represented me, and I've never really been a huge fan. I bet Frank would complain, fairly, if I made a video about how much Christianity sucked and I focused on people like Joel Osteen. And he'd be right to do so. Joel Osteen no more represents Christians than Dawkins does people who don't reject science, in part because Dawkins himself has become a bit of a science denier when it comes to biological sex.
Which, again, means he's ruling out intelligence beforehand, he's begging the question, he's assuming what he's trying to prove, and he is falling right into what Einstein said.
Actually, he's not ruling out intelligence. He has allowed for directed panspermia as a bare possibility, which would mean intelligence. Now, he doesn't personally believe in directed panspermia, but by not ruling it out, he has also not ruled out intelligence. Now, he has ruled out supernatural options, but I still don't care about that. Dawkins' philosophical conclusions are of no bearing whatever to whether evolution is true or not.
That, unfortunately, the man of science is a poor philosopher.
Well, at least when it comes to Dawkins, I can't disagree.
All right, let's go back to Flew, who famously said, follow the evidence where it leads. Who is Anthony Flew? He was the philosophical atheist of the last century, probably the most prominent one, who wrote the article for atheism in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yep, and he famously became a theist not long before his death. I have no opinions on that fact, but I bet Frank sure does.
And in 2005 became kind of a theist, maybe a deist, but he rejected atheism because of the DNA argument, basically, intelligent design. And he always said...
Sounds like he didn't know too much about evolution, just like Dawkins doesn't know too much about philosophy.
Even when he was an atheist, we gotta follow the evidence where it leads. Where does it lead? It appears to lead back to an intelligent designer. Does science say that?
No, it does not, because so far the only predictions that intelligent design can make that are not the same as those of the theory of evolution have been shown to be false. Most notably in neutral variation, which can easily be used to distinguish between common ancestry and common design but separate ancestry. Indeed, intelligent design is banned from being taught in public classrooms in the United States specifically because it is not science.
No, scientists say that.
Oh yeah, I forgot. We're on some stupid tirade against anthropomorphization for some reason. Presumably because Turek is a clod who understands figurative language about as well as Drax.
Nothing goes over my head. My reflexes are too fast. I would catch it.
That's what I'm saying. I think that's what the evidence shows.
I'm sure he does think that, but this is a guy who has shown time and time again that he has no clue how to assess the evidence, or even what evidence exists. I mean, this is the guy who can't tell the difference between punctuated equilibrium and saltation.
Now, I could be wrong.
Yeah, maybe.
Here's the big so what. Last thing. Richard Lalonde, atheist, teaches at Harvard. He's an atheist, a Marxist, a Darwinist, all the ists, okay?
You gotta poison that well.
In 1997, he had a very honest moment when he wrote in the New York Times Review of Books why he and his fellow colleagues don't believe in miracles. He said, it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori, meaning our prior adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
I agree that science doesn't force materialism onto people. One of the ways to tell is to notice how many scientists are themselves supernaturalists. Indeed, not far from where I live is an astronomical observatory, and quite a few of the telescopes are actually owned by the Vatican. While I have many problems with the Vatican as an institution, I don't think they could be reasonably said to be full of philosophical materialists. Science relies on predictability and falsification. The fact is, not all possibly true propositions are easily tested by way of science. Some supernatural claims are in this category, so while I don't think science provides reason on its own to accept them, neither would I expect it to if they were true. This is why most theist scientists don't expect God to leap out at them from their test tubes or telescopes or microscopes or whatever.
Materialism is absolute. We can't allow God in. Why not? Why can't they allow God in?
Well, I won't speak for Lawton because I don't know him, and frankly, I don't care what he thinks about philosophy. The reason we can't really allow God into science is that we don't know how to predict his actions, and they seem to be unpredictable. If God acted predictably, for instance, if there were a detectable threshold of prayer that would actually cure cancer, then he would be let in the door of science. If God exists, he seems not to operate in such a predictable way. And further, what could possibly falsify the notion that God did something? I don't know. So because the hypothesis of miracle has no predictive power and can't be falsified, it's fundamentally not a scientific idea. It has no place in science whether true or not. And the thing is, many things that are true aren't scientific ideas. The assassination of Julius Caesar is a true thing that happened, but it has no predictive power, so it's not exactly something that comes up in science. Science doesn't equal things that are true. It's just one tool that humans use to figure out the reality around them. Now, within its scope, it's fantastically useful, but its scope simply isn't all possible true statements.
Well, if God gets in, no longer are they seen as the new priests who dispense truth to the general public.
Sure, that might be the motive Wanton and his buddies have, but it's not the motive of most scientists, because that's not how scientists tend to see themselves. Indeed, I doubt very much that the Catholics who run the telescopes see themselves as priests of a new atheist religion. In fact, I suspect many of them are actually priests of an old, very much theistic religion.
No longer will they be able to get grant money from the major institutions and from the United States government.
No one gets grant money to promote atheism. Grant money comes when there's a good chance you'll get results. Now, that does mean you're not likely to get money to show that God exists, because fundamentally the hypothesis doesn't really lend itself to scientific testing, at least for the God concepts with which I'm most familiar. But again, plenty of theists get grant money.
No longer will they be seen as buddies with their materialistic colleagues if they let God in.
Maybe, although, materialists can be friends with non-materialists. Maybe Frank can't do that, but I feel like most people can. Friends don't all have to have the same beliefs and philosophical commitments. I doubt I know anyone I can call a friend with whom I agree on absolutely everything with a truth value. That's just life.
And ultimately, they're going to have to bow their knee to a creator because God brings with him moral restraints.
No, Frank's God brings that, but the concept of a God does not. Moral expectations are a common part of God concepts, but they are not necessary. Maybe God just doesn't care what you do. Maybe he's actually immoral. Maybe his morality is so alien to humans that we wouldn't even recognize it as a moral philosophy. Maybe God has moral preferences but doesn't judge humans against those preferences. All of these and more are possible. Belief in a God does not require any particular set of moral beliefs. Now, believing in Turek's God specifically might, but that's neither here nor there. I was, before the series, given to believe that Turek's thing was philosophy, but he's showing himself to be atrociously bad at it, about as bad as he is at biology. Maybe he just sucks at everything except telling a certain group of Christians things they want to hear.
Ron Carlson, who speaks at a lot of college campuses, said once he went into a college campus situation, he was speaking at the invitation of a biology professor, talking about the problems with Darwinism, and after the lecture was over, he had lunch with the professor, and he said to the professor, "What do you think of my lecture?"
This sounds suspiciously like Kent Hovind's almost certainly fabricated story about talking to a UC Berkeley professor on a plane ride.
And the professor said, "Well, Ron, what I think you say is true, but I'm going to keep teaching Darwinism anyway."
Yeah, I'm calling bullshit. Just the professor calling it Darwinism is enough for me to say that this did not happen as reported. That's just not how this conversation would go.
And Ron said, "Why would you do that?" And the professor said, "Because if Darwinism's true, if we did evolve from slimy green algae without intelligent intervention, if there is no God, then I can sleep with whoever I want. Darwinism is morally comfortable."
No one talks like that, and further, nothing about evolution means that there isn't a God making moral impositions that he'll judge you for. The existence of a moral God who cares to judge humans for their actions is a separate question from the mechanism by which biodiversity comes into existence. Maybe evolution is true and God really, really cares what professors do with their genitals. Maybe evolution is false and God couldn't care less what uglies you bump. Maybe evolution is false and God really cares. There's no necessary correlation between these two, and Turek is arguing as if the options are atheistic evolution and Christianity, except that that's not true. There are many options a person could take that are neither atheistic evolution nor Christianity. You can tell simply by the fact that not all non-atheists are Christians. Some are Jewish, Hindu, Druze, Zoroastrian, etc.
At least he's being honest, right?
No, I'm pretty sure this exchange never happened, especially as it's being reported as secondhand hearsay. One of my friends went to an evangelical Christian school to teach evolution, and afterwards he and the professor sat down to talk. The professor told him that he had a lot of good points and that Darwinism was true, but that he'd keep teaching Jesusology. My friend asked why, and the professor said that without Jesus, he couldn't see any reason to stay married. At least he's being honest. Or, maybe that whole thing is incredible in the strict sense, and neither I nor Frank have anything to back up our extremely outlandish tales.
Now, is that the motivation for all scientists who are Darwin? No, I don't know. I'm just saying for him it was.
Who's the him? It's an unnamed college professor in an unnamed school. Next thing you know, Turek will be telling us how his cousin's friend was attacked by a hooked-handed prison escapee in his car, but the only evidence was the deep gouges in the car's body.
Thomas Nagel, who teaches at NYU, said, speaking of Hitchens and Dawkins, they seem to have a cosmic authority problem.
I don't even know what that's supposed to mean.
In fact, I don't want there to be a God either, he said. I don't want the world to be like that. I don't want there to be a God.
Okay, I can see pros and cons. I don't know why this matters. Some people want there to not be a God. Frank is one of the ones who I suspect does want there to be a God. Is he saying that believing things you want to believe is bad? Because if so, then boy is it time for him to look at his own life.
Remember, science doesn't say anything scientists do, and a lot of times scientists have ulterior motives.
Great, but unless that's entering their actual science, it doesn't ultimately matter. Unless there are scientists publishing all sorts of studies trying to falsify theism, then whatever they want to believe about God doesn't matter. What matters is the actual data and analysis that they put into their published work, and whether that is something others can replicate or find flaws in. Anyone can do good work in science and have their work become part of the body of knowledge of science, and they can do it without needing an ideological purity test, and usually without most people even knowing what their religious affiliation is, if any.
That prevent them from following the evidence where it leads, which is a problem because they are making authoritative statements in our society now, and when we don't counter them, our kids, many of them walk away, and only about a third come back by the time they're age 30.
Somehow, I think this has far more to do with the lies that were told by people like Turek than it has to do with kids learning true things about the history of the world. But then again, it's not like I'm a church attendance expert, so what do I know?
They walk away from the church.
I can't imagine why they'd want to walk away from an organization whose spokesperson seems to know less than nothing about everything he talks about. I wouldn't want to be part of an organization that puts this guy on a pedestal either.
So, as Paul said, test all things.
I agree, test all things. The great thing about evolution is that people have been testing it for well over a century, and it keeps on being not falsified. Every time it's tested and found to not be rejected, that increases our confidence in the accuracy of our understanding of biology. Interestingly, the exact opposite keeps happening to separate ancestry, and intelligent design makes so few predictions it's hard to see how it even could be tested.
Don't believe blindly what Einstein, Behe, or Dawkins or anyone says. Look at the evidence for yourself.
I did, and I came to the inevitable conclusion that Einstein was mostly right, Darwin was too, that Behe is a clown, and that Turek is either profoundly ignorant or a liar. Unfortunately, I've more and more come to the conclusion that well-educated creationists are knowingly dishonest. And it's not because I didn't want to believe in God that I did this. When I first investigated evolution, it was very much as a believing an active member of an evangelical church. And my discovering that it was true did not change that fact. The fact did change eventually, but it was for reasons entirely unconnected to evolutionary theory. Although I have to say, the fact that so many evangelical so-called scientists had been lying to me my whole life wasn't exactly an inducement to stay.
Because it's laden with philosophy on all sides of it, and science doesn't say anything scientists do.
That doesn't even mean anything, man.
All right, any questions?
Yeah, lots. But they're not likely to be answered by Frank.
By the way, there's more in this in the book. Any questions for Sean? Let's get him the mic, please.
Great, great talk. I'm appreciative of so many people in the room who've helped me think more clearly, starting Greg's comment long ago that I took to heart, which is ask people what they mean by evolution. Mm-hmm. There's an example in Science this month of science.
I hate when people in Q&A sessions don't ask questions. Just ask your question and be done. Don't give me your life story, or say, this isn't really a question, but... Just have a question in mind and ask it.
Changing the term again, there's an article on the fruit fly who's adapted a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria. That bacteria confers an advantage to protect against a fungus, which is killing or hurting the fruit fly.
I haven't heard about this, but it sounds like a neat example of the evolution of symbiosis.
This is now evolution.
I mean, if it came with a change in the allele frequencies of either the fly or the bacteria or both, then yes. If it's just the novel colonization of these flies by the bacteria without any genetic change, then no, it's not evolution, at least not yet. What that would be is a change in the environment for both the flies and the bacteria.
This is evidence in the journal Science that this is an evolutionary adaptation. And what are they saying? They've adopted a new genome into it.
So then yes, there has been a genetic change in at least one population, meaning that yes, definitionally, this is evolution. It's obviously not all of evolution, but that doesn't make it not evolution. No one paper is going to be published with all we know about evolution. It wouldn't even be possible to read such a paper in a single lifetime, never mind write one, and no writer could keep up with the new discoveries anyway. Just complaining that an example of evolution isn't on its own enough to explain all of evolution is incredibly disingenuous at worst, and extremely stupid at best.
All it is bacteria and the fruit fly living together, but the title is Evolutionary Adaptation.
I can't find any paper in Nature from the time of this talk or earlier that matches this description.
And so again, this isn't, descent with modification through natural selection.
The descent with modification is all we need for it to be evolution, provided that modification is genetic modification. Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution, but even when it's not in play, evolution still occurs. But I'm not clear on why this isn't evolution. His statements about genomes make me think that there were genetic changes in at least one of the species under consideration. So what's the problem here?
This is using this generic term to sort of
gloss
this
over
cloud
right.
of and so great example there.
Of what? So far it sounds like a great example of evolution, but because I don't even know what paper we're talking about, I can't say for sure.
Like
so
climate
great.
change.
What the does climate change have to do with this? I guess it's just that Turek is also a denialist about that.
Yeah. And one other comment, if we're doing feedback.
Well, feedback wasn't solicited, but questions were.
The notion of the scientists and why would they do this? Exactly. I see the personal agendas of scientists. We're human, and we're all sinners.
Interesting. What's the agenda of Dr. Mary Schweitzer or Robert T. Bacher, both professing Christian paleontologists who are firmly in the camp of actual science when it comes to things like common ancestry, evolution, and the age of the Earth? Because I bet they don't have as part of their agenda to discourage the belief in the God they themselves worship.
I think it would be perfect to walk right into Romans 1, 19 and 20 at that point.
Go ahead.
Nah.
Yes, sir.
Just a word about bias.
Yeah, this is the crowd that needs to warn people to beware of bias. As if the whole point of peer review in science wasn't to make sure that bias isn't a deciding factor in science. Somehow, I doubt that Turek is put through anything like peer review to remove his bias. If anything, his peers share and encourage his bias. That would explain why he's so bad at this.
And I owe this observation to J.P. Moreland. J.P. said that in this enterprise, the scientific enterprise, it would be fair to say that both the Christian and the materialist have biases, if what one means by that is that they have preconceived notions about what is possible, and maybe they have come to conclusions about what actually took place.
Again with the stupid false dichotomy of Christian and materialist. I know this isn't true of most Christians, but there seems to be a set of Christians who just can't imagine the idea that other religions exist. Well, they do. Further, one doesn't have to believe in any particular religion to believe in non-material or supernatural things. Maybe someone is not affiliated with any religion, but believes that there are ghosts.
But Buddy points out, and this is the observation I think you can take to the bank.
I very much doubt any bank would want any of this.
The bias of the theist informs the discussion in a different way than the bias of a materialist. The bias of the materialist limits the options that the kinds of answers that he can come up with in any circumstance. He has got to come up with answers that comport with naturalism and materialism. Okay, the bias of the theist, though, is different. It expands the kinds of explanations that are available to him.
This is strictly true, but in the context of science, the expanded set of options aren't useful, because they're not amenable to scientific testing, and so they're not able to be considered in science. Scientific ideas have to be testable, and so if your philosophical position allows you to consider untestable possibilities, that's fine, but what you can't then do is pretend that those options are things science can consider. They're fundamentally pseudoscientific options, even if they're right, so the theist is at no advantage in terms of science. If a supernatural cause is the real cause of a phenomenon under scientific investigation, then the most science will be able to do is to fail to make progress in explaining that phenomenon. The origin of life and evolution are not in such a circumstance, so they don't even meet the best possible case scenario for an indication of a supernatural God cause. And of course, even without progress, that doesn't make the reason God. So even if it were the case that there were not progress in those areas, it wouldn't actually be evidence that God did it miraculously. It just wouldn't be evidence that God didn't do it miraculously. And I add in the miraculous bit because most Christians believe that the main way God acts in the world is in fact through natural processes. all of which he put in place in his creation of the universe, and so in some sense natural processes are an outgrowth of the will of God. Science has absolutely nothing to say about that, but it's why so many theist scientists have seen their investigation of the natural world using natural mechanisms as an investigation into the mind of God, from which they believe flow the principles according to which the universe acts and is organized. I'm not here to advocate for that position, but just to point out that even methodological naturalism does not preclude a belief in a God or an atheist agenda like Kukul is implying.
He can take and adopt a materialistic explanation if it turns out to be the best explanation for the circumstances. So you hear thunder and you say, well, what is that? Is that the gods bowling? I don't know, let's check it out. Then you find out that there is a materialistic explanation that's completely adequate to the task.
Jesus hit a strike.
Yeah. but the theist has also has the alternative of a non-materialist or a non-event causation. They can go to an agent that is outside of the system if the evidence warrants it.
Cool, now we just need to see evidence that warrants stepping outside of natural explanations when it comes to evolution. Turek sure didn't give any. Further, notice how close this is to just the God of the Gaps, because the places anyone is most likely to suspect the evidence warrants stepping away from methodological naturalism are exactly those areas with no currently known adequate naturalistic explanation. Sure, the idea that you want positive evidence for the action of a non-material actor technically moves it out of the realm of the God of the Gaps, but what would such evidence look like? I don't know, and I don't think Kukul knows either.
So JP's point is that the bias of the theist actually allows the theist to follow the evidence where it leads.
Maybe, but what we've actually seen in this talk is theists following evidence to where it absolutely does not lead. So in practice, the minor advantage of this extra explanatory freedom seems to be countered by an inappropriate bias towards invoking supernatural explanations, despite adequate naturalistic explanations. In the end, there's no clear advantage to theism, and there could even be a disadvantage, although I wouldn't go to the trouble of arguing for that, since frankly I'm too lazy for that.
So his bias, that is his expanded view then, is actually an advantage in discovering the truth.
Funny then how theists aren't overrepresented in science, but rather underrepresented. It's almost like it doesn't really give an advantage in science. Maybe it gives an advantage in other areas, but it doesn't seem to in the domain of science, which is what we're talking about here.
Where a materialist is not allowed to follow the evidence where it leads, he is only allowed to follow the evidence to a materialistic conclusion.
Which, at least in terms of methodological naturalism, has led to the invention of the technology that Kukul is relying on to record and display his image and words. Seems to be working pretty well, and it also seems like a reason to oppose the idea of getting rid of methodological naturalism in science. At least until someone figures out how to make technology that reliably works on the basis of a non-natural entity. Let me know when the reliable prayer-powered light bulb comes out.
So his bias, then, in principle at least, can restrict the pursuit of truth.
The Christian's more open-minded.
Do I even need to say anything about that?
Yes, we're open to both causes. We're open to intelligent and non-intelligent causes. Yes, go ahead.
The very existence of this talk is prima facie evidence that, at least in some areas, these Christians are absolutely not open to natural explanations. Because we have that, and they reject it anyway. This whole video series shows that when Frank Turek says he's more open-minded than naturalists, and is willing to accept natural explanations when there is evidence for such explanations, he's just lying.
Well, just to agree with Greg on that, Paul Nelson did a talk at Biola a couple of years ago where he was talking about this exact thing, and he was saying, if you're a carpenter, you want all the tools you need in order to do the job. And in essence, what's happening in the origin of life debate is they're taking away a tool where you cannot explain certain things at all.
Maybe, but progress keeps being made, so it seems that that tool hasn't been necessary so far.
You just can't do the job. And Paul Nelson's very good at showing how there's certain things that require intelligence. He does some things where, if...
Maybe I should look into this Paul Nelson guy.
A band, marching band spells out cow on the field. That takes prior notion. It's a teleology argument. And he's like, you can't, if you don't have the tool of explaining with intelligence, you can't explain cow on the field.
Okay, but fun fact, this isn't an analogy for anything explained by evolution. What part of the marching band is the genetic code? What about the crowd reading the word spelled out by the band is analogous to anything in biology? I don't know. It seems like an abysmally bad analogy.
So I just wanted to agree with Greg on that.
Good for you, Guy.
Very good. You can explain cow dung, but not cow. Okay? And even then, you need an intelligent cow to do that. Yes, go ahead.
It is very important, the way you pointed out, there's different types of science.
There are different kinds of science, but science isn't divided up into historical and operational science. The distinctions Turek likes to draw are ones foreign to the actual scientists doing real science.
The general public has been kind of educated to think that science is empirical science and it's proven.
Well, definitionally, all science is empirical. If what you're doing isn't empirical, then what you're doing isn't science. But also, I don't like the word proven, as all of science is provisional. It's just that some of the provisionally held conclusions of science are so robust and long-standing that we no longer realistically expect them to be overturned. The theory of evolution is as close to being proved as anything in science really is, at least in broad terms.
Both of which aren't accurate. Because the thing that they're starting to get in school districts, but only barely, is that there's also HD, hypothetical deductive science, hypothetical inductive science, and...
That is a term I was not familiar with, but let's see what Britannica has to say about it, as they'll give a concise explanation. If we need to, I can get more extensive sources. Quote, hypothetico-deductive method, procedure for the construction of a scientific theory that will account for the results obtained through direct observation and experimentation, and that will, through inference, predict further effects that can be verified or disproved by empirical evidence derived from other experiments. An early version of the hypothetico-deductive method was proposed by the Dutch physicist Christian Huygens, 1629 through 95. The method generally assumes that properly formed theories are conjectures intended to explain a set of observable data. These hypotheses, however, cannot be conclusively established until the consequences that logically follow from them are verified through additional observations and experiments. The method treats theory as a deductive system in which particular empirical phenomena are explained by relating them back to general principles and definitions. However, it rejects the claim of Cartesian mechanics that those principles and definitions are self-evident and valid. It assumes that their validity is determined only by the exact light their consequences throw on previously unexplained phenomena, or on actual scientific problems. End quote. Well, now we know what it is. I'm not sure how this is important to the question of evolution versus pseudoscience, but maybe this guy will tell us.
It's supposed to be taught, like a school district near us, they have it as part of their objectives, but there's maybe one page on it, and they don't really teach it.
I'm not sure what it is that he wants them to teach exactly. That axioms are bad in science? That direct observation and experimentation is important?
So, if that's brought into the consciousness a little bit better, they'll realize, or the hypocrisy will be exposed a little bit more.
How so? I don't know how the hypothetico-deductive method of science poses some challenge for evolution or some great advantage for intelligent design. One group of people who wouldn't pretend that some model for how science already works is a problem for the science it describes are my subscribers. So if you don't want to be a weird pseudoscientist who can't explain the philosophy of science while relying on it to make his stupid points, why not subscribe? While you're at it, make sure to turn on all notifications and like this video. All those things really help me out.
But like you called it forensic science, but it's recognized that there are other types. I mean, most things Einstein did, that he's making, inductions and...
Right.
Yeah, which were then backed up by direct observations and experiments, which makes what he did seem entirely compatible. Indeed, it's not even proposed as a new method of science, but rather as more of a description and framework for understanding how science works. Now, some have argued that since it seems to have a binary falsification versus confirmation dichotomy, whereas actual science is all about probabilities, that this way of looking at science is incomplete, something I tend to agree with.
But, yes...
It can also be called origin science, whereas empirical science is called operation science, however you want to term it.
I just can't escape Ken Ham, can I?
What's that?
Historical science.
Historical science is another way of looking at it. When we do New Testament, we're doing historical science.
No, you're not. You might be doing history with New Testament texts as your sources, or some of your sources, but science and history are not the same thing. They don't have the same techniques, although they can and do interact.
Right. It's still a science. Bobby, you had something? Pass him that back if you would. And just two more, and then we got to take a break for lunch, and then we're going to come back for Richard.
They might come back, but I don't plan to.
Thank you. This is real quick. Just from your experience with the whole topic of science, philosophy, in your experience in other churches presenting the Big Bang and whatnot, you had mentioned this yesterday, I believe, pretty quick. Do you get much pushback from young earthers, 6,000 years versus, millions, billions, Cambrian periods and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Can you
great.
explain a little bit?
Yeah, great question. Here's how I answer it.
This is an interesting question. The only reason to think that the history of life is better explained by Frank's ideas than evolution is the idea that the Bible is in some ways literally true. And the young earthers are more consistent with that idea than Frank is, and the young and flat earthers even more so. The only thing Frank can really do is to point to evidence of the old age of the Earth, just like young earthers counter flat earthers with evidence of the large-scale positive curvature of Earth's surface. But there's a problem with that. Theistic evolutionists can do the same thing to counter Turek's anti-evolution. So I am curious how he deals with this problem.
Okay, and you can get a lot of hostility. So I always say, look, I don't know how old the Earth is. Could be old, could be young.
What a cop-out.
On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I think it's old. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I think it's young. And on Sunday, I take the day off.
So he addresses it by just avoiding the problem. How convenient. And I guess it's the case that there are some problems I'm not interested in tackling, so I suppose I can't judge too harshly. But still, this seems like an easy topic to get evidence about and form a conclusion. Just ask yourself, do you care about the evidence or your already decided conclusion on the basis of your interpretation of a particular collection of books?
The most important point is that there was a creation, not when there was a creation.
I mean, from Turek's point of view, that seems fair, but then it's still an important part of your interpretive framework for the Bible, as well as for your basic epistemological framework, whether your interpretation trumps the physical evidence or not. Turek is clearly willing to toss out and not engage with the evidence when it runs counter to what he considers his core beliefs, but isn't willing to do that consistently. Maybe he deep down knows just how stupid a young Earth is, but because it's what his theological commitments dispose him to, he just lives in a permanent state of dissonance and so can't talk about the topic. I can't say. I'm not a psychologist and I'm not even a linguist. I'm just a dinosaur. I bite the heads off of sauropods.
And I illustrate, I say, the evidence seems to lean more toward an old universe, but you're still making assumptions you can't prove. For example, you have to assume the speed of light hasn't changed.
Actually, no, we don't, because if it had changed, we could see that in the emission spectra of distant objects. We don't.
Principle of uniformity? Probably a good assumption.
Yeah, it's the assumption that allows any science at all. Without it, there's no way for inductive reasoning to work at all. It's a well-known fact that induction needs the axiom of the uniformity of nature in order to be valid. Without the assumption that the universe operates the same in the past, present, future, as well as at distance, there's no reason for past experience to predict future experience.
But some are saying they can detect variations in the speed of light now. So I'm not 100% sure it hasn't changed.
All I'm aware of is new measurements that all tend to agree within their margins of error, and studies about light getting a lower effective speed in various media, such as oil or water.
Any other sort of dating method requires assumptions you can't prove, including all the carbon dating methods, uranium dating, decay rates, all have to be assumed. You can't be absolutely sure.
Well, you can't be absolutely sure about anything in science, but other than the assumption that allows for induction in the first place, I still haven't found any creationists giving any of these assumptions that are actually untested assertions. They're all assumed not because we need them to be true, but because they've already been tested, and so now we can use these ideas in future science. If you want to do some physics, you don't have to start over with Newtonian mechanics and then personally demonstrate and derive all of physics from there. You can just start with well-established physics as a background assumption. But importantly, that doesn't mean that the rest of physics is believed without evidence. That's the opposite of what's going on. It's the same with radiometric dating. The assumptions are not simply accepted for funsies. They're the conclusion of other science which is already well established.
With regard to the Bible, does the Bible necessarily teach a young Earth?
It depends on what parts you want to take literally. Everyone picks and chooses.
Not necessarily. Why? Because the day Yom in Hebrew could mean more than 24 hours. It does in Genesis 2:4, where it says the day the Lord created. The sixth day appears to take longer than is allotted because Adam names all the animals, right?
No, because the Genesis 2 creation account is a separate account from the 6-day creation account in Genesis 1. There's no particular day of creation in Genesis 2, nor is it clear that all the events in it take place on the same day. Nor did the author of Genesis 2 know how big a task naming all the animals was. That's part of the problem with trying to historicize these accounts. They aren't even compatible from one chapter to the next in much of Genesis. That's why everyone has to pick and choose which parts to take literally, which parts to take figuratively, and which parts to just ignore. I guess Frank is ignoring the genealogies and the solid dome over the flat earth with windows in it. Young earthers tend not to ignore the genealogies, but tend to ignore the whole dome and windows bit, whereas flurfs are all in.
And Brad Stein, a Christian comedian, has a bit on this. He said, that must have been a long day. In the beginning of the day, Adam was all fired up. He'd see an animal come by. He'd go, rhinoceros! Then he'd see another one come by. He'd go, hippopotamus! By the end of the day, cow.
That brings up a question. What language is Adam being imagined speaking? Is it Hebrew? We know Hebrew is not the oldest known language, so that seems unlikely. What's the deal? Let me know in the comments what you think if you have an idea. But note, I'm asking about the internal logic of the story, not whether it's true history or not.
He's just had it, you know. It seems to take longer. Also, the growth of fruit-bearing plants and all that seems to take longer.
Longer than what? Or maybe the author of Hebrews was just making an analogy and not a literal commentary on the timeline of creation. Just a thought. Also, of course, Genesis was compiled long before the book of Hebrews was composed, so it wasn't written with Hebrews in mind.
And finally, the seventh day certainly is longer than 24 hours because we're still in the seventh day right now, according to Hebrews 4.
Or maybe none of it is historical, and at best you can draw moral and theological ideas from it, but it has no bearing on the actual past history of the universe.
So if the seventh day is longer, maybe the other days are longer, right?
Well, I don't think the purpose of any of the authors of Genesis was to teach how old the earth was. I think they just had a background assumption that seeps through into their writing.
On the other hand, it could be 24-hour days. I mean, it could teach that it's young.
Already a laughably dumb thing to say, since they are absolutely no more right than flat earthers, but let's let Frank cook.
Either way, the more important point is that God created. I can guarantee you this, and this is what I do say to young earthers. I say, you may be right.
Yeah, everyone knows that you're not Orthodox unless you join the one true Catholic and Apostolic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Sorry, just a joke. I know that's not what he meant.
You may be. But let me just point this out. If you are right, don't make it a test for orthodoxy for everybody else.
Hey, just extend that argument to evolution and see why maybe being a dogmatic anti-evolutionist is also a bad move tactically for Christianity. The irony is basically blinding at this point.
Because if you make it a test for orthodoxy for everybody else, you may keep people out of the kingdom because you're saying in order to be a Christian, you've got to be a young earther when some scientist thinks the evidence is much better that it's old. What, are you going to make me check my brains at the door? No, I'm not going to do that. Christianity's false now. And he's rejected the whole thing because of your young earth view.
Fun fact, the idea of dying and going to heaven as the general permanent post-mortem expectation of Christians is a fairly recent thing. Historically, there was some idea of dwelling with God, but the main thing was that Christians were awaiting the general resurrection of the dead when they would be physically raised from the dead with new bodies.
Because I guarantee you this, when you get to heaven, God isn't going to say, did you think it was old or young?
According to Frank's theology, sure, but not even all Christians share that theology. There are Universalist Christians, and Christians who think that those who had insurmountable barriers to faith in Christ won't have that held against them, etc. I just like to point out the internal variation in Christianity because people like Turek often pretend that Christianity is far more homogeneous than it really is, and that they represent the core of Christian belief and practice. They are incorrect about that, and in fact, people like Frank here are generally on the fringes both currently and historically when it comes to Christian belief and practice.
Old, you're out of here! No, what did you do with Jesus is going to be the issue, right?
There's no more debate about the age of the earth between science and creationists than there is about the germ theory of disease versus the miasma theory of disease.
So, it's an interesting topic, it's an intramural debate.
Who wants to bet that that strategy, if taken seriously, is already being undermined by Turek just by being an anti-evolutionist? I don't know, because I haven't actually seen this far, but let's find out, shall we?
But I don't think it's something we ought to divide over. I think we ought to just say, look, that God created is more important.
Two things to add to that, and these are strategic, so I'm not taking a side here.
Well, if you think the historicity of Genesis is an important part of the authority of the Bible, then they're right.
Those who are young earthers say if you don't take a young earth view that you're undermining the Bible and all of Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Hey, that's also true for the rejection of evolution, Greg. So I guess you should stop pushing that bullshit too. Oh man, who could have guessed I'd be right about where he was going with this? It's almost like I debunk this stuff for a living.
My experience has been it's just the opposite. If people have the sense that they have to accept a young earth view of the Bible, they aren't going to take anything in the Bible seriously because to them that is completely untenable.
Allow me to introduce the Christian ministry Biologos, who says exactly that about not just the Big Bang, but also evolution. The thing is that fundamentally, I don't really disagree with what Kukul is saying here. Now, I'm not here to push Christianity or make it seem more or less plausible on the whole, but if I were trying to push it and make it seem plausible, then I'd take as much from science as I could to see how I could use it in my favor. It's just that Greg isn't actually doing that. He's rejecting major aspects of science, even though based on the fact that most Christians don't do this, it's not necessary for him to do it. He should take his own advice that he applies to the old Earth and flat Earth and just apply it to evolution as well. Talk about how amazing God is that he set up a system whereby organisms can adapt and spread and diversify all on their own without constant tinkering from some engineer who, by all appearances, kinda sucks at his job.
And so, there's a strategic concern there. There's a second element of strategic concern. If by adopting the Big Bang at face value and then using it in our favor, we are taking something that the other side actually believes is true and leveraging it to our effect. Instead of saying there was no Big Bang, we're going to say, okay, let's just pretend that your view is right, and let's see where it takes us. Well, your view takes us to our view. In other words, your assessment about the beginning of the universe is better explained by our worldview, not by your worldview. The third strategic element, too, is that it is hard enough to get people to trust Christ.
Sounds like a you problem, buddy.
We want to try to have them jump through as few hoops as is necessary for them to deal with the real issue, their rebellion against God.
Says the man currently participating in a talk all about setting up one of those hoops.
Evolution is a big problem.
Not for many Christians, including about half of my regular co-hosts on my live streams. That's right, I stream live on this channel, every Tuesday and Saturday. So if you haven't seen any of those yet, why not check them out? While I do consider the scripted stuff on the channel the core of my output, those are fun opportunities to hang out with my viewers, have fun, and dunk on some peak stupid. Usually of the creationist variety, but not always.
So we're going to try to deal with that and nullify that as a barrier.
The quick way to do that is to just stop pretending it's a barrier in the first place. And I'm not even saying that Greg and Frank here have to agree that evolution is real. Just that they stop pretending it's incompatible with Christianity.
But if in getting people to accept that there might be some problems with evolution, that's a big deal.
Especially when you can't come up with any problems that couldn't be overcome by an undergrad in biology without much more than a moment's thought.
With a lot of these folks. If we got to get them to jump through the hoop of a young Earth, do you see how much more difficult we're making the situation for ourselves?
Not really. Anti-evolution, young Earth, flat Earth, and geocentrism are all similarly implausible and stupid. I guess one could say that the fewer you ask people to accept, the better for your ideology, which would, I guess, be why anti-evolution but not young Earth might be preferable to anti-evolution but agnosticism about the age of the Earth. But you could just require none of them. That's always an option.
And so from a strategic perspective, I think it's just better to set that on the side, have intramural discussions about that issue, but not make this a point of contention on the public stage, because it makes our job very much more difficult.
Now that is irony.
Yeah, well, one more question. Yes, go ahead, Jacob.
On the Cambrian explosion, every time I've read about that, seen anything about that, like they talk about having every major type of phyla.
I think he just means most of the modern phyla, because major type of phyla is neither grammatically correct nor a semantically meaningful phrase, near as I can tell.
But then they always show like these crustacean-looking things.
There are a few Cambrian crustaceans, like Canadapsis, but most arthropods in the Cambrian are definitely not crustaceans, which I think just indicates that this guy isn't really up on his arthropod anatomy, which is okay. He's not the one representing himself as some kind of expert. He's more the victim here.
Does that include like more humanoid type looking structures?
No, humans come later.
Okay.
What an odd question. But yeah, the earliest thing I might call a humanoid would probably be the apes of the Miocene, which is hundreds of millions of years later.
I'm sorry. I mean, I just don't know anything about this. So, I mean, I'm trying to figure this all out. How does that all fit together with that?
Humans come later. Go ahead, Greg. You're gonna say.
Is there anything Greg won't butt in on? But also, I applaud this guy for admitting he doesn't know about this stuff and looking for answers. I just hope that between when this was recorded and now, he got some answers from people who actually know what they're talking about.
If you remember from high school zoology, it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
Well, what about superphyla, and infraorders, and subfamilies? Turns out things are much more complex than you learned in school, and none of these ranks actually means anything. They're all arbitrary signposts put on the objectively existing nested branching hierarchy of life. A nested hierarchy that can only be meaningfully explained with predictive power through descent with modification.
So, kingdom is the first division, plant and animal.
And fungus, and let's not forget the fact that it kind of breaks down when you're talking about what used to be called protists, but sure.
And then the phyla are the next big divisions.
Except it's not. Just counting humans, some of the taxa below kingdom but above phylum include Eumenozoa, Parahoxozoa, Bilateria, Nephrozoa, and Deuterostomia. Why aren't any of these the level under consideration for where common ancestry can begin? Maybe God created the first bilaterians, and then from that evolved humans and squid.
The important thing to keep in mind is that in terms of development, all of the major classifications of living things, not every novel feature of living things like bipedal locomotion or something like that, but every basic body structure, which is what the phyla describe, is in place at the very beginning.
Except that that's just blatantly not true. The distinctions above phyla often extend into the Precambrian, and even then, during the Cambrian, some of the modern phyla evolved after the earliest age. That's just a blatant mischaracterization of the Cambrian. The history of what we now think of as phyla, the very concept of phyla, and how taxonomy works.
Out of nowhere.
Yeah, the Ediacaran doesn't exist. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
After that, it's refinements, and some of the refinements are dramatic.
But refinements also define the differences between the earliest members of the phyla, too. That's the thing. One of the predictions of evolution and universal common descent is that as you go back in time, the members of what are now very distantly related groups look more and more like each other, because as you go back in time, they're literally more and more closely related. That's why so many Cambrian creatures just come down to a different kind of worm, or a different kind of thing that has too many legs.
So you don't have any bipedal internal skeleton bone structured things in the Cambrian explosion.
That's true.
But what you do have is you have a dorsal nervous what do they call it? Dorsal
notochord. Unless of course we're talking about protostomes, then it's the digestive system that's dorsal.
Nerve cord, chordata.
Almost.
A phylum chordata, I guess, is what we are. So all of the creatures that have a dorsal nerve cord are part of the phylum Chordata, and that was established early on.
But there are still other groups related to chordates, like hemichordates, and going a bit further out, the echinoderms. So it's not just that Chordata popped out of nothing. We know about its evolutionary history.
It's good to make this distinction because what we're not saying is that pretty much everything that we see now was there then. What we're saying is that the basic body plans, which is the most foundational level of development.
Except it's not. I just mentioned 3 phyla that all share the common developmental fact that when they are developing, the first indentation that forms on the embryo becomes the anus, and the second indentation becomes the mouth. That's a more basic thing than having a notochord, and it's shared by a wider group than the phylum. So this conflation of phylum with the most basic level of shared morphology is just flatly wrong. I've already in this series gone over the similarities among the panarthropods, which include among the living Tardigrada, Arthropoda, and Onychophora, but include even more animals in the fossil record. They too are united by even more basic aspects of their development in biology than those which unite the individual phyla. This idea that the phyla are somehow the basic level of organization within Animalia is just flatly false. It's not true. It's wrong. It's worth about as much as a presidential denial of an affair.
We're virtually all in place instantaneously in the record.
Also not true. That's why we have the Ediacaran and early Cambrian dominated by stem groups related to, but not members of modern phyla. Because these phyla defining traits weren't in place in our earliest fossils.
And that there's been no additional body plans that have been added since then.
Okay.
Well, since there's no rigorous definition of what a body plan even is, we can't say. I might argue that the body plan of an octopus is fundamentally different to that of a clam, and therefore, yes, both bivalvia and cephalopoda are in fact new body plans that have evolved within mollusca. But so what? They're still mollusks, and that has been arbitrarily set as the phylum level taxon to which they both belong. So no matter how different in body plan a cuttlefish and an oyster are, they're in the same phylum.
With maybe a couple of rare exceptions.
Yeah, I'm not strong on science, and every time I've read about this, it hasn't been clear to me what exactly they've meant by that, so thank you.
That's because creationists can't be clear on what they mean by this, because any way they could be clear about this would show that they're just wrong.
I might want to make one final point here, and it's a point we made yesterday, but it should belong in this presentation too. Even if you grant the atheist macroevolution,
something done by every creationist I've ever interacted with, as long as you don't let the creationists redefine macroevolution.
Again, the atheist doesn't get rid of the need for a designer, because you need a creator and designer to start the universe, to design the universe.
Maybe, but I certainly haven't heard anything here that would support that contention.
To start and design life.
Not based on what I've heard in this talk. That was the whole point of this talk, and it was an abysmal failure.
Even if after you get the first life you could explain it by some sort of natural process, which, as we pointed it out, doesn't appear to be the case, but even if that's so, you still got a creator, you still got a designer. And then we mentioned those other immaterial things we talked about, information, morality, reason. Those types of things are completely alien to the materialistic worldview.
No, they're not. They're just immersion phenomena, which are not in any way precluded by materialism. Maybe Frank has elsewhere argued that they're better explained by a supernaturalist worldview, and I don't really care. But no materialist thinks that morality or information are incompatible with their worldview.
Yet they use those things to argue against it. The very fact that these people have reasons to say that God doesn't exist shows that this is a reasonable world.
I fail to see why the consistency of nature is only explicable by means of a divine creator. Perhaps to be real, nature simply has to be consistent in some ways. I don't know.
That reasons matter.
And say again?
That reasons matter.
Yeah, that reasons
the
matter.
The process of reasoning can help us to determine what's true about the world.
And if
I mean, yeah, that's true, but these guys have been doing a piss poor job at reasoning.
If they're true, if they're right about molecules in motion, then reason doesn't even work.
Nope, I'll just repeat my calculator bit here. Look, a calculator is just electrons in motion. Yet, if I ask it to perform arithmetic functions, it reliably gives the right answer. Nothing about the possibility that mind reduces to material components indicates that it is, for that reason, incapable of coming to a correct conclusion on the basis of good evidence or rationale. If the mind boils down to ions and molecules going around doing things, that's not fundamentally different to a calculator reducing down to electrons going around doing things. And just like the latter is generally reliable, so too can be the former. I'm not saying it has to be, but I see no fundamental reason why a purely physical brain cannot produce a mind capable of reliable reasoning. Further, I see no reason why an immaterial mind must be any more or less reliable than a material one.
So, always back out of this, because you can get down in the weeds on this stuff and argue over these particulars and never realize that they're trying to pull weeds with tools they don't have.
That's a new analogy for me, but I guess it works.
Right? They just don't have these tools in their materialistic worldview, so you got to back out and show them, even if you're right here, your worldview can't explain all this other things.
And so we get to the presuppositionalist cherry on top of this shit sundae. And that's it. The rest is cringy 2000s techno that makes it seem like we're in a nightclub in the Matrix, with an address to send fan or presumably hate mail to Frank. Well, that's the last episode. It wasn't so much about science, but honestly, that's okay. It was a nice change of pace for me. I hope you appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my other content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Thoravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elleron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, John Ackerman, Eta V, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.